Hey, guys. It's time to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Europa never asked to be part of a myth. She was a princess of Phoenicia, just a girl really picking flowers by the sea. The day was warm, the sky harmless. No omens, no warnings, just sunlight glinting off the waves and the laughter of maids in grass. Then came the bull. Massive, gleaming white, with horns shaped like a crescent moon and eyes that seemed too calm, too intelligent. She didn't know it was Zeus. She only knew that the creature knelt before her like a gentle dog. She stroked its neck. She giggled. It nuzzled her hand. Europa, so young, so curious, climbed onto its back, and the bull ran not just through the meadow, but into the ocean, into the salt and the foam and the endless blue. Her laughter turned to screams. The shore vanished. No one could reach her. No one even knew where she went. She held tight to its neck as waves rose and the sea widened like a closing mouth. When they landed on Crete, it was too late. The bull transformed. Not a beast at all, but a god Zeus, naked in his power and pride. There was no consent, no conversation. She was raped by the king of the heavens and left behind with nothing but grief, confusion, and eventually sons. Zeus gave her gifts to make it seem fair. A bronze robot to guard her, a magical javelin, a hunting dog that never failed, tokens of his divine affection. But he never stayed. He left her in a foreign land to rule a kingdom she didn't ask for. Her name lived on. Yes, Europe. The continent bears it still. But what about her voice? Her mourning, her home she never saw again. Europa's story isn't just about a girl stolen by a god. It's about the thin line between worship and violation, about how the powerful rewrite stories to make horror sound like romance. They carved her name into maps, crowned her as queen, but they never asked her if she wanted any of it. Europa disappeared into legend. But she was once a daughter, a sister, a child by the sea, and she never went home. Leda was not a girl in a meadow. She was a queen, a woman of power, grace, and poise, married to King Tyndareus of Sparta. Her life was structured, ceremonial, dignified. But even queens aren't safe when Zeus desires something or someone one twilight as she walks along the riverbank alone. She saw a swan crash into the reeds, pure white, feathers wet, trembling as if wounded. It looked helpless, pursued by an eagle. Instinctively, Leda reached for it. She cradled it in her arms like a child, heart pounding with maternal sympathy. That was the moment Zeus chose, because it was no ordinary swan. It was him, Zeus in disguise, yet again. He had taken the shape of something delicate, something unthreatening. He had weaponized innocence. What happened next depends on the storyteller. Some say he seduced her, others say he raped her, but no version ends with her having a choice. That night, Leda lay with her husband as well, and soon she laid not one, but 2 eggs. From them hatched 4 children, Castor and Pollux, Helen and Clytemnestra, 2 divine, 2 mortal twin boys. Twin girls, twin destinies. Her children were beautiful. Too beautiful, too powerful. Helen's face would spark the greatest war in myth. Clytemnestra would go on to murder her own husband. The sons would become warrior heroes, one destined to die, the other immortal. But none of them were ordinary. None of them were untouched by Zeus. Leda's story, like Europa's, is never told from her point of view. In paintings, she's often draped across a bed, swan curled over her, eyes closed as if asleep. But that's the lie of art. What's never shown is the fear, the shame, the confusion, the horror of being held by a god who pretends to be something soft. She remained a queen. She endured. But her daughter's legacies will be marked by blood, betrayal, and blame. Helen, seen as a temptress, Clytemnestra as a killer, and Leda, just a footnote in their tragedies. No matter how high her crown sat, she would always be the woman the swan chose, the one who couldn't stop what came out of those eggs. And she too never got to choose her myth. Io was sacred, a priestess of Hera, devoted and chaste, set apart from ordinary women. She wasn't naive. She knew the risks of proximity to power, especially divine power. But that didn't matter. Zeus doesn't ask. He takes. One night, a thick mist fell upon the sanctuary, a cloud unnatural in its weight, its silence. And from it Zeus emerged. No disguise this time, just divine force cloaked in fog. He came to Io and violated her within the walls she thought were holy when the fog lifted. She was no longer a girl of the temple. She was marked, and Hera, ever watchful, noticed to hide the affair. Zeus did what no god should have the right to do. He transformed her into a cow, a beautiful heifer, pure white, with sorrowful eyes. And so the girl who once prayed now mooed. The priestess became livestock, but Hera wanted vengeance. She accepted the gift of the cow and assigned Argus Panoptes to guard her, a giant with 100 unblinking eyes. Io could not speak, could not cry out, just wander, graze, and suffer under Argus's stare. Eventually, Zeus sent Hermes to slay Argus. That part, at least, is told with celebration in Olympus. But what's rarely mentioned is what came after Hera sent a gadfly, a tiny stinging insect, to torment Io. It bit her endlessly, drove her across continents. She ran in agony from Greece to Egypt, through marsh and mountain and desert. Imagine it. A divine victim, stripped of language, swatting at pain, chased not just by a fly, but by the wrath of gods. No one could hear her, no one recognized her, and she could not speak her name. Eventually, Zeus restored her to human form. She bore a son, Epiphus, and became revered in Egypt. But that happy ending is the myth's polite curtain drop. What about everything she lost? Her voice, her station, her safety, her body, the sacred trust of the goddess she once served. Io's story is told as a wandering epic. How the Nile got its name, how Zeus saved his beloved. But underneath is a girl transformed into something she never was. Punished for something she never asked for, and through it all, she never stopped running. Semele was no princess in distress. She was proud, clever, and beautiful, a Theban noblewoman who caught the eye of Zeus himself. But unlike so many others, Zeus didn't trick her, at least not at first. He courted her openly. Disguised as a mortal man, he whispered love into her ears. He brought her storms in a bottle, stars in his promises, and she believed him. They met in secret, the god and the mortal, and soon she was pregnant. Semele dared something most mortals never did. She wanted to see the truth. Not the mask, not the illusion, but Zeus in his full divine form. She wanted honesty. But the gods are cruel, and Hera crueler still. Hera, consumed by jealousy, disguised herself as an old crone and visited Semele. She planted a single poisonous seed. If he truly loves you, why won't he show you who he really is? It worked. Semele, now uncertain and aching for proof, asked Zeus to reveal himself in all his godhood. Zeus hesitated. He begged her to ask for anything else. He had sworn an oath, the unbreakable promise of the river Styx. So he kept it. And when he unveiled his true form, lightning, fire, divine flame, Semele saw, and in the same breath she died. Her mortal body, fragile and unprotected, was incinerated in an instant, consumed not by betrayal, but by revelation. She had trusted him, loved him, and died for it. But the story doesn't end there. Inside her burned body, her child still lived. Zeus reached into the fire, rescued the fetus, and sewed it into his own thigh. Months later, from that impossible womb, Dionysus was born, god of wine, madness, ecstasy, and ritual. Semele became myth, then memory, then ash, her name attached to a shrine, her son raised to Olympus. But her story? A caution, a quiet tragedy. What's told is that she was too bold, that mortals must never ask to see the truth. But what she really did was ask to be loved honestly, to be seen by the one who claimed to adore her. And for that, she was destroyed. Love, when tangled with power, burns. And Sirmiel never had a chance to survive the fire. Callisto was wild, not untamed like a beast, but free like wind. One of Artemis's most loyal companions, a sworn virgin huntress who traded palace life for forest trails, Eros. And sisterhood. She didn't wear gowns or weave tapestries. She chased stags and howled at the moon. But even sacred oaths meant nothing to Zeus. He saw her in the woods, grimy, fierce, laughing, utterly alive, and decided he must have her. But how to approach a woman who served the goddess of chastity? He didn't come as himself. That would be too honest. Instead, he came in the most perverse disguise of all. He took the form of Artemis. Callisto saw her goddess step through the trees, trusted the familiar face, and when she reached out in reverence, it wasn't Artemis who touched her. It was Zeus. Some versions say she fought, some say she froze, but no version says she consented. Afterward, Callisto kept the secret. She buried the shame. Months passed. Her belly swelled. Her sisters noticed first, then Artemis herself, and the judgment came swift and cruel. Artemis, cold as stone, expelled her, cast her out like a traitor, not a victim. Callisto was banished from the only life she had ever chosen, her oath shattered by a lie she couldn't explain. She gave birth alone to a son, Argus. No husband, no support, only silence. And then, as if exile weren't enough, Hera added another punishment. She transformed Callisto into a bear, a mother, a woman, now a beast. Years later, her son, now grown, a hunter, stumbled upon the bear in the woods. He raised his spear. He did not know. How could he? And just as he would have struck, Zeus intervened. Not to apologize, not to make amends, but to avoid another tragedy. He hurled them both into the heavens. Callisto became Ursa Major, the Great Bear, and her son Ursa Minor. Some call it an honor to live in the stars, but it wasn't mercy. It was avoidance. Callisto never regained her form. Her story was written in stars, but never heard in her voice. She was a follower of Artemis, a survivor of Zeus, a mother who nearly died by her son's hand. And all she ever wanted was to be left alone in the woods. Before Zeus ever laid eyes on Dini, her fate was already sealed by a prophecy. Her father, King Acrisius of Argos, was told that Dini's son would one day kill him. Terrified of his future, he did something monstrous in the name of prevention. He locked his own daughter in a bronze chamber underground. No windows, no escape, a tomb made for the living. She was young, royal, and utterly alone. The chamber was meant to keep men out, but it couldn't keep gods out. Zeus didn't appear as a bull or a swan this time. He came as a golden showeries. Ancient poets really called it that. A stream of liquid gold that slipped through the cracks in the ceiling and fell upon her skin. That's how she conceived Perseus. No warning, no voice, just divine invasion cloaked in beauty. When Acrisius discovered she had given birth, he didn't ask how. He didn't wonder what she had endured. He simply saw a threat. And so Danae and her infant son were stuffed into a wooden chest and thrown into the sea. Imagine that. A mother clutching her baby, waves crashing over the lid, salt choking her breath, knowing that her own father had condemned them both to death. But fate wasn't finished with her. The chest didn't sink. It drifted. It landed on the island of Seriphos, where she was taken in by a fisherman, safe for a time, until the island's king, Polydectes, decided he wanted her. She refused him, and so he plotted to get rid of Perseus, her son, her only defender. The king sent him on a suicide mission to slay Medusa. Danae again waited in uncertainty. Again, she was a pawn in a man's story. Yes, Perseus triumphed. Yes, he returned and saved her. But why is her resilience always treated as a footnote? Danae was caged, violated, exiled, threatened, and yet she endured. She raised a son while navigating the cruelties of prophecy, divine lust, and political danger. And somehow she survived it all. She is remembered as the mother of a hero. But she was a prisoner long before her son became legend, and no god ever came back to ask her how she felt about any of it. Alcmene was faithful. She had waited years for her husband, Amphitryon, to return from war, refusing all suitors, holding fast to duty and honor. When he finally came home, she welcomed him into her bed. Or so she thought, because that night the man who came through her door wasn't Amphitryon. It was Zeus wearing his face, his voice, his scent. He stretched the night to 3 times its length and took what wasn't his. When the real Amphitryon returned the next day, Alcmene was confused, alarmed. She questioned him, realized what had happened, but it was too late. She was already pregnant. She gave birth to twins. One child, Iphicles, was her mortal husband's. The other, Heracles, belonged to Zeus. Hera, of course, noticed, and though Alcmene was the victim, Hera made her the target. She sent 2 serpents into the nursery to kill the infants. Iphicles screamed, but Heracles, just a baby, strangled the snakes with his bare hands. That was only the beginning. As Heracles grew, so did Hera's hatred. She drove him to madness, made him slaughter his own wife and children, and Alcmene, the mother who bore him, had to witness it all. Her son, the strongest man alive, was broken, cursed, tormented because of a crime she never committed. Alcmene's life was consumed by divine fallout. She had no affair. She made no choice. Yet everyone around her suffered. Later myths try to smooth it over. They say she found peace, that her son was deified, honored, that she lived out her days in safety. But even immortality feels hollow when it follows a life of manipulation, loss, and divine cruelty. No poet ever asked how it felt to be touched by a man wearing your husband's skin. No statue was carved of her grief. Alcmene is remembered as the mother of Heracles, the demigod hero, but she was also the woman who raised a child she didn't ask for, who bore the weight of a god's crime and the world's expectations, and still remained upright. She was never worshipped, never thanked, just left behind in the wreckage of Zeus's legacy. And in the shadows of every one of Heracles' labors stood the mother who suffered first. Antiope was a princess of Thebes, born to nobility but doomed from the start. Zeus didn't come to her as light or storm or animal. He came as something filthier. He took the form of a satyr, half man and half beast. He attacked her in the wild, and the stories rarely pause to question whether she fought or cried. They simply move on. Pregnant, disgraced, and terrified, Antiope fled her home. Not to chase love, not to fulfill destiny, just to survive. Her father, humiliated by what had happened, ordered her capture. Her uncle Lycus hunted her across the countryside like an animal. When they finally caught her, she was dragged back to Thebes and handed over to Dirce, Lycus's wife. And then the true torment began. Dirce didn't just punish Antiope. She humiliated her, enslaved her, bound her in chains. Day after day, year after year, Antiope was beaten, mocked, made to kneel, all while carrying the twin sons born from Zeus, Amphion and Zethus. But Zeus didn't intervene. He never does after the act is done. Instead, the twins were abandoned at birth, raised by shepherds in the wilderness. Antiope was left behind, alone, imprisoned and broken. Her sons grew into strong, intelligent men, unaware of who they truly were. When they finally learned of their mother's suffering, the rage came fast. Amphion and Zethus stormed Thebes, overthrew Lycus, and exacted brutal revenge. Dirce was tied to a bull and torn apart. It's told as justice, a blood-for-blood ending. But what about Antiope? She was free. But what does freedom mean after years of torture? After your body has been made a battleground for divine violence and human cruelty, no myth lingers on her healing. No bard sings of her recovery. Her story ends the moment her sons triumph, as if her value was only in birthing them, not surviving what came before. Antiope was chased, imprisoned, and hurt for choices she never made. She didn't ask to be loved by a god. She didn't ask to be hated by a queen. She just ran through forests, through pain, through shame, and never stopped running until her son stopped it for her. And even then, no one asked her how far she'd come. Aegena's story begins like so many others, with desire from above and no warning. She was a nymph, daughter of the river god Asopus, born near the waters that should have protected her. But nothing ever protected a woman once Zeus noticed her. He abducted her. Some myths say he carried her off in the form of an eagle. Others say he simply snatched her from the riverbank and flew across the sky, taking her to a desolate island where no one could hear her scream. There, in isolation and silence, he had his way with her. The island became hers in name, Aegina, as if naming it after her made the assault noble, as if being claimed by Zeus gave her power. It didn't. It just made her a symbol of another place shaped by divine conquest. She gave birth to Aeacus, a future king, but Hera, ever watchful, discovered what had happened. And as always, she didn't punish Zeus. She punished the woman he used. This time, Hera's wrath wasn't directed at Aegina's body, but at the land itself. She unleashed a plague. People dropped in the streets. Fields turned barren. The entire island, now bearing Aegina's name, became a graveyard. And Aegina, surrounded by death, could only watch. She had no divine power to stop it, no magic to reverse it. Just a mother with a child trapped on a cursed rock. Zeus, perhaps moved by her sorrow, or more likely wanting to salvage his legacy, transformed ants into people. The essence. From the soil and dead trees, he fashioned the Myrmidons, a race of tireless warriors, and repopulate the island. But what about Aegina? She lived among these insect-born men, surrounded by reminders of the lives Hera destroyed. Her name carved into maps, her son honored by heroes, but her trauma once again erased. She was reduced to geography, her pain written off as myth. People remember the Myrmidons for their loyalty and strength. They remember Aeacus as a wise king, but they forget the woman who never asked for any of it, who lost her home, her people, her safety, all because a god couldn't keep his hands to himself. Aegina didn't want an island. She just wanted to be left alone. Alara's story is barely a whisper in the grand theater of mythology. No wars, no stars, no temples, just silence and earth. She was a mortal princess, distant, dignified, and unnoticed, until Zeus found her as usual. He desired her as usual, Hera noticed. But this time, Zeus didn't seduce or disguise. He hid. He feared Hera's wrath so much that he buried Alara deep beneath the earth. Literally. Not in metaphor, not in poetry. He placed her in a secret cavern beneath the ground so Hera wouldn't see what he was doing. There, in complete darkness, isolated from air and sky, Alara carried his child. What must that have been like? No sun, no voice, no help. Just stone walls and the slow, suffocating growth of something monstrous inside her. Because the child she carried wasn't a delicate half-god. It was a giant Tityos. So massive, so unnatural that he grew and grew until he could no longer fit within her body. And then he tore his way out. That's how Alara died. Not in glory, not in peace. Not even in divine rage, but in labor and agony alone. Her womb became a tomb, and her body was destroyed by the very thing Zeus put inside her. The myths barely pause to mention her name. Tityos becomes the focus, a giant punished in the underworld for trying to violate another goddess. But Alara, she doesn't get a constellation. She doesn't get a shrine. She gets a footnote. The irony is brutal. Zeus hid her underground to protect her, but that protection killed her, and he never came back to lift the stone. The ancient poets called her the Earth-Hidden One, as if that made her mysterious, mystical, or part of some grand cosmic puzzle. But she wasn't a puzzle. She was a woman buried alive because a god wanted her and couldn't be bothered to defend her. And when she died, the earth swallowed her story with her. Alara's name survives barely in old texts and dusty scrolls. But her voice, her fear, her death, those were never written down because in the end, even the earth couldn't hold the weight of a god's secret. Metis wasn't a mortal. She was a Titaness, a goddess of wisdom, thought, and deep cunning. Unlike many of Zeus's lovers, she wasn't caught off guard in a meadow or a bedchamber. She was his equal, his advisor, his first wife. She didn't fall for his power. She guided it. She helped him win the Titanomachy, the war against the old gods. She was clever, careful, and essential. And when he wanted her, she became his partner. But power never tolerates competition for long. Metis became pregnant, and that's when the prophecy arrived. Your child will surpass you. A daughter first, then a son who will overthrow you. Zeus heard the words and, true to form, panicked. But he didn't rage or run. He played it calmly. Then one day, as Metis stood beside him, perhaps even comforting him, he tricked her into transforming into a small creature, a drop of water, a wisp of air. And he swallowed her just like that. His wife, his counselor, the mother of his unborn child, gone. But Matisse didn't die. She remained alive inside him, thinking, watching, pregnant. She crafted armor for her unborn daughter in the depths of his body, and the hammering echoed in his skull. The pain grew unbearable. One day, unable to endure it, Zeus begged Hephaestus to split his head open with an axe, and from the wound sprang Athena, fully grown, armored, brilliant. A goddess born not of pain, but through it, born from a womb made of fear. The world praised Zeus for birthing wisdom itself, for carrying the goddess of war and strategy in his mind. They called it a miracle. But no one asked where Matisse went. She didn't emerge. She wasn't thanked. She was forgotten. The woman who helped shape the cosmos was erased by the very god she built up. Her daughter was honored, revered, but she remained imprisoned forever in his gut, a ghost beneath Olympus. Matisse represents the final cruelty. Even when a woman is divine, intelligent, powerful, even when she consents, creates, and contributes, she is still disposable. She was the mind behind the throne, and she was swallowed to protect it. Long before he could speak, before he could even cry, Oedipus was cursed. His life began with a whisper from the gods, spoken not in love, but in warning. The oracle of Delphi, with smoke in her lungs and madness in her eyes, told King Laius of Thebes a prophecy so unnatural, so vile, it struck terror straight through his bones. Your son will kill you and marry your wife. Laius went pale. Jocasta, his queen, fell silent. Their unborn child was no longer a blessing. He was a threat, a walking omen. And when the baby was born, healthy and pink and blinking at the ceiling of the royal nursery, no one celebrated. Laius made a decision. He pierced the baby's ankles and tied them together with leather, crippling him, marking him, making it harder for the gods to guide him. Then he gave the infant to a servant and commanded him to leave the child to die in the wilderness. No name, no cradle, no goodbyes. But the servant, perhaps moved by pity or fear, couldn't go through with it. He handed the baby off to a shepherd from Corinth, a man who worked the hills, not the palace. That shepherd, in turn, brought the boy to the king and queen of Corinth, Polybus and Merope, who had no children of their own. They named him Oedipus Swollen Foot, a name that would echo his twisted fate. They raised him as their own, never telling him he had been adopted. He grew up loved, respected, cherished, a prince with a future carved in gold. But deep beneath his skin, prophecy stirred. A curse cannot be silenced by silence. Oedipus didn't know the truth of his birth, but the world did. The gods did, and they would not be ignored. His life would not be his own, not for long. This was no fairy tale. There would be no escape from the words spoken in Delphi, only the illusion of safety until truth, like fate, found its way home. And so the boy who should have died on a mountain was now sleeping beneath Corinthian silk, unaware that he had already taken his first step toward his father's grave and his mother's bed. Oedipus was raised in luxury, but luxury never silences doubt. He grew up in the palace of Corinth, surrounded by tutors, servants, and silk-draped corridors. King Polybus and Queen Merope treated him as their son, and Oedipus believed them until someone laughed a little too loudly at a banquet. You're not really their child, a drunk noble scoffed. It was just a careless insult, but it clung to Oedipus's mind like smoke to fabric. He asked Polybus. He asked Merope. They denied it, of course. Swore he was theirs. Hugged him a little too tightly, smiled a little too long. But the doubt didn't die. And so he went to Delphi. Not for riches, not for glory, for the truth. The oracle didn't answer the question he asked. Instead, she gave him a prophecy of her own. You will kill your father. You will marry your mother. Oedipus staggered from the temple in horror. Kill Polybus. Marry Merope, the parents who raised him. Never. He wouldn't let it happen. He wouldn't go home. He would walk the earth instead. That was the first mistake. In trying to outrun the prophecy, he stepped straight into its path. He left Corinth, turning his back on the only family he'd ever known. He walked dusty roads, past shrines and crossroads, carrying nothing but fear in his chest and a vow on his lips. I will never fulfill that prophecy. But Oedipus, like so many before him, misunderstood the gods. They don't give you the future so you can change it. They give it to you because it cannot be changed. His ankles still bore the scars from mountain. He had been marked by fate before he'd ever spoken his name, and now he was walking blind toward a father he didn't know and a mother he'd never met. Every step forward was a step deeper into the trap. But he believed he was doing the right thing, that he was noble, that he could rewrite what the god had written. Oedipus was not evil. He was a man desperate to be good, desperate enough to never look back, even as the prophecy circled him like a vulture in the sky. The road narrowed at a fork, dust curling in the heat, trees watching like silent judges. It was there that Oedipus met a stranger in a chariot. An older man, proud, flanked by servants, a lord or a king. The road wasn't wide enough for two. A simple argument. Whose right of way? Whose authority? But the stranger sneered. One of his men struck Oedipus, and something inside the prince snapped. Not rage exactly, but something darker, something tangled with fear and fate. He fought back, hard, brutal. By the end, the man lay dead. The servants, too, except one who fled into the hills. Oedipus wiped the blood from his hands, breathless. He didn't know the man's name, didn't care. Just another traveler, arrogant and cruel, removed from the road like an obstacle. He had no idea he just killed Laius, king of Thebes, his father, the very man who had ordered his death as a baby. The prophecy had begun to unfold, not with fanfare, not with some mystical sign, but in a roadside scuffle. A stranger made angry, a choice made in haste, a few inches of steel. The moment passed like any other. Oedipus kept walking. He never paused to wonder what he'd done. There was no grand realization, no thunder from the gods, just a prince with no name, a corpse with no legacy, and a prophecy slowly cracking open beneath their feet. This is how fate works. It doesn't shout. It whispers. The crossroad was no accident. In Greek stories, crossroads are sacred. They are where choices meet the divine. And Oedipus had made his choice. Violence instead of patience, pride instead of peace. But can we blame him? He didn't know. That's the tragedy. He thought he was avoiding the curse. Instead, he was fulfilling it with every step, every blow, every breath. The gods didn't force his hand. They simply built the road. And Oedipus, young, afraid, certain he was doing the right thing, walked it willingly. Behind him, the dust settled. The dead king's blood soaked into the soil. Ahead of him, a riddle waited. The city cried out for a savior, and the throne stood empty, aching for a son to return home at the gates of Thebes. Death had made a nest. The city trembled beneath the shadow of the Sphinx, a creature with the body of a lion, the wings of an eagle, and the face of a woman. She was not merely a monster. She was a curse sent by the gods, or perhaps by fate itself. She asked a single question of every man who dared approach the city. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 in the evening? No one had answered correctly. They had tried, of course. Warriors, scholars, princes, all failed, all died. The Sphinx devoured them on the spot, leaving their bones to bleach in the sun just outside Thebes. And the city, paralyzed by fear, waited. Their king had vanished, their queen mourned, their people starved. Then came Oedipus, dust-covered, hardy, weary, unaware that the blood of his own father still stained his sandals. He stood before the Sphinx and listened to her riddle. She stared into his soul, waiting to crush another life in her claws. But Oedipus didn't flinch. He didn't fight, he thought. He looked past the terror and saw the truth hiding inside the question. Man, he answered. In childhood, he crawled on 4 legs. As an adult, he walks on 2. In old age, he leans on a cane, a 3rd leg. Silence. The Sphinx screamed not in anger, but in defeat. She leapt from her perch and hurled herself into the rocks below. The curse was broken. Thebes was saved. The people poured from the gates, cheering, crowning Oedipus not just as a hero, but as their king. The throne, left vacant after Laius's mysterious death, now belonged to the stranger who answered death's riddle. As a reward, they offered him the queen, Jocasta, beautiful, widowed, older but still regal. She placed the crown on his head. She took his hand in hers. Neither of them knew. The prophecy, patient and silent, had just been fulfilled halfway. A murder and a marriage, both veiled in triumph. The city rejoiced. Oedipus smiled. Jocasta kissed her savior, and above them the gods said nothing, because fate doesn't strike all at once. It unfolds like a riddle answered too soon. Years passed. Oedipus ruled Thebes with a steady hand and a sincere heart. He was not a tyrant. He listened to his people. He protected them. He fathered children, 4 of them, with Queen Jocasta, never knowing she was the woman who had once nursed him as a baby. Together, they rebuilt the city. The past seemed forgotten, but fate doesn't forget. One morning, Thebes began to rot. A plague swept through the streets like a punishment. Crops withered, livestock dropped dead, women miscarried. The gods had turned their backs, and the people turned to their king. They cried out, "Oedipus, you who defeated the Sphinx, saved us again." And he tried. He sent messengers to the oracle at Delphi to ask why the gods were punishing them. The answer returned like a blade. The land is polluted. The killer of King Laius lives unpunished in Thebes. Find him. Exile him. Only then will the curse be lifted. Oedipus stood before his people and made a vow. He swore to hunt down the murderer, to bring justice, to rid the city of its stain. He did not flinch. He did not suspect it. He believed the killer was someone else, some stranger hiding in plain sight. A traitor, a coward, someone else. Oedipus became obsessed. Every whisper became a clue. Every silence became suspicious. He interrogated witnesses, called upon prophets, ordered investigations, and with every step he moved closer to the truth. But the truth was patient. It watched as he tangled himself in his own certainty. He thought he was healing his people, that he was cleansing the land, that he was standing tall as a just king. Then trying to root out the infection, he was digging into his own soul. The gods did not scream. They didn't strike lightning. They simply waited for Oedipus to uncover what they already knew. He had both the disease and the doctor. The king he vowed to avenge was the father he had killed. The queen he kissed goodnight was the mother who had birthed him, but he didn't see it yet. Not then. Not as the city choked on ash and prayers while their king marched toward his own unraveling. When answers slip through mortal hands, kings turn to those who hear the gods. Oedipus summoned Tiresias, the blind prophet of Thebes, the man whose visions reached beyond time, whose blindness saw more than any set of eyes. If anyone could solve the mystery of Laius's murder, it was him. But Tiresias did not want to speak. He stood silent in the royal hall, lips pressed shut like a tombstone. The air trembled with tension. "Speak," Oedipus commanded. "For the sake of the city, tell me who killed Laius." Tiresias shifted, uncomfortable. "You don't want the truth." "I do. You can't bear it." That's when Oedipus made his second great mistake. He pushed too hard. He accused Tiresias of betrayal, of lies, of conspiracy. Perhaps the prophet himself had helped the killer escape. His anger burned so bright it blinded him more than any curse. So Tiresias finally spoke. "You are the killer you seek." The words landed like thunder. The court froze. Oedipus laughed, bitter, stunned. "Me? I didn't even know Laius. I was nowhere near Thebes when he died, but Tiresias didn't blink. You are closer than you think. You are your father's killer and your mother's husband." Silence. Jocasta paled. Oedipus roared in denial. He called the prophet mad, a fraud, a puppet of political enemies. But the seed had been planted, and seeds, even of prophecy, always grow. Tiresias left without another word. He didn't need to explain. His part in the story was done. He had struck the first crack in the wall of Oedipus's certainty. The king stood among nobles and whispers, swearing he was innocent, swearing he was loyal, swearing this was madness. But doubt, once born, doesn't die easily. And somewhere in the back of Oedipus's mind, the voice of the oracle stirred again. You will kill your father. You will marry your mother. He had tried so hard to escape that future. Now the past was clawing its way back through the walls. The plague still ravaged the streets, the gods still turned away, and the man who once solved riddles now found himself living inside one. Piece by horrifying piece, Jocasta watched her husband unravel at first. She dismissed the prophecy with a gentle smile and careful hands. She tried to soothe Oedipus's growing fear. Prophecies mean nothing, she told him. We once received one too, long ago, that our son would kill his father, but we handled it. She looked away when she said that, her voice caught just briefly. We abandoned him, left him on a mountainside as a baby. That child is long dead. Oedipus went still, a child left to die, ankles pierced. He felt something ancient stir in his bones, pain in his feet. He'd long since learned to ignore. He asked questions. Too many pressed her for details. What mountain? What servant? When? Jocasta begged him to stop. Why dig up the past? She whispered, You've saved thieves. You are a good king, a good man. Let this rest. But Oedipus couldn't rest. The prophecy pressed against his ribs like a blade. Tiresias had planted doubt. Jocasta's story watered it, and now it bloomed. Into obsession. He sent for the old servant, the one who had taken the baby from the palace that day, the one who might still know the truth. Jocasta begged again. Let the past lie. I love you. We have children. What does it matter who you were? But for Oedipus, identity wasn't a comfort. It was a curse waiting to be understood. He believed that if he could uncover the truth, he could outmaneuver it, rewrite it, solve it like he had the Sphinx's riddle. He didn't understand that this was no riddle with a clean answer. This was prophecy, and prophecy always demands a price. Jocasta saw where this was heading, her face once regal, now drawn with dread. She had lived with the edges of the truth for years, perhaps even guessed it. But she had chosen to bury it, chosen silence over collapse. Now Oedipus was pulling the bones from the ground, and for the first time, the queen who had welcomed him into her bed was looking at him like a stranger. You are doomed, she whispered, tears spilling. And if you go any further, so am I. But Oedipus couldn't stop, because once you start chasing truth in a Greek tragedy, you don't get to stop until it devours you. The old man stood before Oedipus, trembling, not from age, but from memory. He had served King Laius long ago, had held the infant prince in his arms, had pierced the baby's feet himself, wincing as the soft flesh split, as the blood ran down the child's legs. He had tied the ankles, left the boy for dead on the slopes of Mount Sidharon, but he hadn't killed him. Another shepherd had taken the baby. That shepherd, Oedipus now knew, had brought the child to Corinth, to King Polybus and Queen Merope. Oedipus felt the floor tilt beneath him. Say it, he whispered. The old man wept. That child was you. Every breath in the room stopped. Oedipus, king of Thebes, solver of riddles, beloved husband and father, was the child who was supposed to die. The boy who grew up far from Thebes, unaware of his bloodline, had walked back into it like a moth toward flame. He had killed Laius at the crossroads. He had married Jocasta, his mother. He had fathered children who were now both his sons and his brothers, his daughters and his sisters. The truth hit like thunder. He had spent his life running from the prophecy, shaping himself into the kind of man who could defeat fate with will and reason. And yet every step had led him deeper into the exact future he feared. Oedipus did not scream. He did not deny. He simply stood there silent, as if time had frozen around him. His whole identity, prince, outcast, savior, king, crumbled in a single breath. He was the plague. The city had not been cursed by the gods. It had been cursed by him. Every prayer, every funeral, every sick child gasping for air was a consequence of one man's fate colliding with the city's need. He had vowed to find Laius's killer and exile him. Now the killer stood alone, and he knew what he had to do. But first he had to face her. The woman who had kissed him, crowned him, bore his children, the woman who had once held him as a newborn, the mother he had made his queen. Jocasta didn't wait to hear the servant speak. She had seen it in Oedipus's face. She had seen it forming in his words, in the shape of his questions. In the unbearable precision of his doubt, the truth had crept through the palace like smoke. She had fought it for years, burying it beneath ceremony, motherhood, and silence. But now it stood naked before her. Oedipus was her son, her child, the infant she had surrendered to death out of fear, out of loyalty to a prophecy she had once believed too cruel to be real. And now that prophecy has not only come true, it had dressed itself in love, in wedding robes, in children with her eyes and his smile. She turned from him before the servant could speak. Her hands shook, her breath caught. The palace corridors twisted around her. She didn't scream. She ran past the guards, past the servants who lowered their eyes into the inner chambers where no one dared follow, and there in the silence of their marriage bed, the bed that had held a mother and son wrapped in unknowing love, Jocasta took her own life. Some say she hanged herself. Some say she used the brooch from her gown, sharp and cold and final. But no one says she cried out. She left the world in silence, the way she had endured it. When Oedipus found her, he fell to his knees. He touched her face, her gown, the body that had once cradled his infant form, then welcomed him again as a man, and now a third time as the corpse of a woman who had loved too much and understood too late. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The gods had spoken years ago in Delphi. You will kill your father. You will marry your mother. And now the prophecy lay fulfilled across every shattered piece of his life. The people outside still waited for justice. The city is still burning with plague. But in that room there was only silence. The queen who couldn't live with the truth had chosen her exit, and the man who uncovered it was about to choose his punishment. There are some truths the eyes were never meant to see. Oedipus stood over Jocasta's body, his hands shaking. The room seemed smaller now, as if the walls themselves recoiled from what had happened. The silence was not empty. It was judgment. The gods had spoken through prophecy. He had walked every cursed word of it. But prophecy never tells you what to do afterward. He could have fled, could have thrown himself from the palace walls, could have begged the gods for mercy. Instead, he reached for Jocasta's brooch. The sharp pin glinted in the dim light. He held it for a moment, then, without hesitation, plunged it into his eyes. Once, twice, again. Each stab a cry to the heavens, each puncture a scream without words. Blood poured down his face as light fled his world forever. Why blindness? Because the eyes had betrayed him. Because they saw love where there was incest, justice where there was murder, salvation where there was ruin. The eyes had seen everything and understood nothing. So he destroyed them. The man who once solved riddles with clarity of mind and sharpness of vision would now wander in darkness, stripped of every illusion. He emerged from the palace, a horror to behold, his robes soaked in blood, his face scarred and dripping red tears, his hands outstretched like a beggar. The people gasped, covered their mouths, turned away, but he did not hide. "This is justice," he said. The man who had promised to exile Laius's killer now understood the cost. "I am that man," he told them. "Drive me out. Cast me from the city. Let Thebes breathe again." No one moved at first, not even Creon, Jocasta's brother, who now stood quietly at the palace steps. Oedipus, their savior turned scourge, was no longer king, no longer family, just a man with a broken past and no future. He asked for exile. He begged for it. He pleaded not to see his children again, the children who were also his siblings. The gods were silent, but Thebes listened. And the king, who once stood tall at the gates, who answered riddles, slew monsters and ruled with pride, now limped into darkness. Not because he couldn't see, but because now, finally, he truly understood. Oedipus left Thebes not as a king, but as a shadow of one. Blind, barefoot, wrapped in rags, he wandered the earth with only his staff and his daughter Antigone to guide him. She was still a child, yet already burdened with the weight of her father's sins. Sins he never meant to commit. The world looked different now, not because he couldn't see it, but because he finally could. People whispered his name in fear. Some drove him away from their gates. Others offered pity, but never comfort. He was no longer the man who had saved Thebes. He was the man who brought the gods' rage upon it. But Oedipus never asked for sympathy. Only silence, only distance. He passed through cities and forests, past shrines and graves, never resting long. In his blindness, he spoke more gently, thought more deeply. He had lived as a prince, a savior, a king, a monster. Now he lived as a question. Was he guilty? Was he cursed? Or was he simply human? The gods had said what would happen, but they never said how he should feel about it. They gave him a script, but not a conscience. Years passed. His beard grew long. His voice became gravel. Antigone stood taller, always at his side. She loved him not because he was innocent, but because he was hers. And finally they arrived at Colonus, a grove sacred to the Furies near Athens. There Oedipus stopped walking. He sat beneath the trees, breathed the sacred air, and whispered to the earth, "I am ready." Some say the gods forgave him. Others say the earth swallowed him whole. That thunder cracked, and he vanished between the roots, leaving nobody behind. Just legend. He did not die as a king. He did not die as a monster. He died as a man who carried his own curse. A man who could not change the prophecy, but tried. A man who walked into darkness, and in doing so found a kind of light. Oedipus's story isn't just a tragedy. It's a warning that knowing the truth does not always bring peace. That fate once named cannot be outrun, and that sometimes the most heroic thing a man can do is face himself. Before Athena ever drew her first breath, she was already a danger to Olympus. Zeus sat upon his throne, storm-eyed and victorious, ruler of gods and men. He had overthrown Cronus, his own father, ending the age of the Titans, but deep in his bones, Zeus feared one truth. The throne he stole could be stolen from him. And then came the prophecy. It was not shouted by oracles or carved in lightning. It was whispered in dread by Gaia, mother of the earth, and Uranus, father of the sky. If you lie with Métis, the child she bears will overthrow you. Zeus froze. Métis wasn't just any goddess. She was a wisdom incarnate, clever and sharp, cunning beyond measure. She had helped him in his rise to power. She was not a victim. She was a partner. And now she carried his child. The first child, they said, would be a daughter, wise and strong. But the second would be a son, and that son would be greater than Zeus, stronger, smarter, fated to topple the sky. Zeus had felt the sting of prophecy before. He knew what it meant to be the overthrower. And he knew what happened to those who waited too long. He couldn't kill Métis. That would defy divine law. So instead, he swallowed her. Yes, Zeus opened his mouth and devoured the goddess whole, swallowed her mind, her magic, her unborn child, just like his father Cronus had once swallowed him. But Zeus didn't digest her. Métis didn't vanish. She lived inside him, thinking, whispering. Creating the wisdom he consumed didn't dissolve. It waited. And so Zeus walked Olympus with calm eyes and a storm beneath his skin. He thought he had ended the prophecy, controlled fate, outwitted destiny. But God should know better. Inside the god of thunder, a goddess was growing, not in darkness, but in brilliance, not in fear, but in armor. She would not be born in blood. She would be born in defiance. Athena, the daughter of wisdom and power, was coming, and even Zeus, king of the sky, would not be able to contain her for long. Zeus believed he had ended the threat. He walked the halls of Olympus as if the prophecy had died with the swallowing of mates. Thunder cracked at his will. The other gods bowed low. No one questioned the king who had consumed his own fear. But fear doesn't digest. Inside Zeus, Métis lived, not as a ghost or regret, but his thoughts still forming. She spoke to him in dreams, murmurs in his chest, ideas he couldn't explain, strategies that arrived unbidden. Her mind became his, but not entirely. And inside that divine mind, something extraordinary was happening. A child was growing, not in a womb, but in a skull. This child wasn't weak. She didn't kick softly or scorn. She forged armor in the folds of her father's brain, forged a spear from thought, a helmet from resolve. As she grew, the sound of hammering echoed inside Zeus's head. Day and night, the pounding worsened. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. His headaches grew unbearable, like storms crashing behind his eyes. He pressed his palms to his temples and roared across Olympus. No god dared approach, but pain has a way of humbling even kings. Finally, Zeus called for help. Hephaestus came, the divine blacksmith, strong and quiet, born of flame and forge. He stood before the king of the gods and asked no questions. Zeus knelt, clutching his head, trembling with agony. "Strike," he ordered. Hephaestus lifted his axe. One clean blow to the center of Zeus's skull, and the heavens held their breath. The crack echoed across the world, and from the split in Zeus's head, wrapped in light and war song, stepped a goddess, fully grown, clad in golden armor, shield in one hand, spear in the other, eyes like polished steel, gleaming with intelligence. Athena. She did not cry. She did not stumble. She stood tall. The goddess of wisdom had not been born in softness or secrecy. She had emerged in force, forged in thought, and delivered through agony. And for the first time, Olympus saw something even Zeus could not control. Not fire, not storm, but reason. And she had arrived, not as his downfall, but as his daughter. When Athena stepped from Zeus's skull, the heavens did not tremble. They paused. Olympus, a realm of drama and fury, of vanity and storms, fell silent. The gods, who had seen monsters born from chaos, lovers from foam and vengeance from blood, had never witnessed anything like this. She was born not of the body, but of the mind. Not from the womb or sea or bone, but from thought itself. She stood tall in shining armor, golden, flawless, divine. Her shield gleamed like morning sun on polished bronze. Her eyes didn't flicker like flames. They watched, measured, weighed. She was not at war's fire. She was a war discipline, and she said nothing. She didn't need to. The gods murmured. Aphrodite blinked. Hera frowned. Ares scoffed, but none dared question her place. She had not claimed Olympus by force like Zeus. She had not tricked her way in like Hermes. She had been born into it like an answer. Zeus, nursing the wound in his head, looked at his daughter and did not fear her. He should have, not because she would betray him, but because she would surpass him in ways that mattered more. He ruled with lightning. She would rule with clarity. He broke what he couldn't bend. She bent without breaking. That day, Olympus gained more than a new goddess. It gained a conscience. Athena was named the goddess of wisdom, yes, but more than that, she was strategic. She was not just clever. She was tactical. She didn't act from rage or passion. She planned. She prepared. She paused. And that made her dangerous. To some, she was a marvel, sharp as a blade, calm as the sea before battle. To others, a threat wrapped in beauty. Even Ares, the god of raw war, eyed her with distrust. He fought with fury. She fought to win. The other gods celebrated, of course. They cheered, offered gifts, and feigned joy. But deep beneath their toasts, Olympus shifted. Because now there was someone on the mountain who didn't shout, who didn't seduce, manipulate, or destroy, she thought. And when Athena thinks, the world changes, not with thunder, but with strategy. Zeus had many children, but none like Athena. He fathered gods of wine and war, of music and mischief, each with their gifts, each with their flaws. But Athena, she was his alone, born from his mind. Not his desire, forged in pain, not passion. And that made her different. She wasn't ruled by impulse. She didn't beg for favor or fear punishment. She didn't tremble before his temper or flatter his ego. She challenged him, not openly, not foolishly, but in the quiet way that cuts deeper. She questioned, she advised, and sometimes she disagreed. Most of Zeus's children mirrored him, flames that fed his storm. But Athena was something else entirely. She was reflection, restraint, the side of power that asks not can I, but should I? And that made Zeus uneasy. He adored her, yes, favored her above most. He gave her honors, the Aegis shield, a place at his right hand, even the power to wield his thunderbolt in his absence. But even in that trust, there was fear, not of rebellion. Athena never sought to dethrone him, but of irrelevance. She didn't need to rage to make an impact. She didn't need drama. When disputes rose on Olympus, Athena rarely shouted. She watched, waited, then spoke, and silence followed. Her voice carried weight because it carried thought. She began to guide the gods, even when Zeus didn't ask for her counsel. When war brewed between mortals, she wasn't just present, she was planning. She turned battles with whispers, not screams. It was then Zeus realized the truth. He hadn't swallowed the threat. He had raised it. The prophecy had said a child of Métis would overthrow him. But Athena didn't need a throne to change Olympus. She didn't want power in the way the others did. She simply was powerful, subtle, measured, and precise. And that frightened Zeus more than any uprising, because while he ruled the sky, she began to rule the mind, not through force, but through influence. And in Olympus, influence is everything. Athena chose solitude, not because she feared love, but because she didn't need it. Unlike Aphrodite, who stirred desire in gods and mortals alike, Athena kept herself untouched. She had no lovers, no consorts, no entanglements. Her power came not from seduction or motherhood, but from something rarer, independence. She was a virgin goddess by choice, and in Olympus that was a statement. It meant she owed no one her body. No god could claim her. No mortal could tame her. She was not defined by her relationships, only by her purpose. And that purpose was protection. Athena was war, yes, but not the kind that left cities burning for the joy of it. That was Ares, her half-brother. He relished blood. She calculated victory. Where Ares charged in blind rage, Athena planned the ambush. Where he screamed and bled, she waited in silence, then struck where it mattered most. The Greeks would worship her not just as a goddess of wisdom, but as their guardian, a protector of cities, a builder of walls, a defender of law. Her armor wasn't for glory, it was for duty. She walked the battlefield like a surgeon walks an operating room. Calm, exact, efficient. She never wasted energy. She never raised her spear without a reason. Mortals feared her, but they also prayed to her. Because if you were righteous, if your cause was just, if your city stood for order, Athena would fight for you. And unlike other gods, she didn't demand temples soaked in sacrifice. She asked for cleverness, courage, and a plan. In myth, she remained untempted by vanity. When a sculptor dared to carve her form too beautifully, she destroyed his work, not out of rage, but to remind the world, I am not here to be admired. I am here to act. Even the gods tread lightly around her. Not because she was cruel, but because she was certain. She did not scream to be heard. She spoke with truth, and truth shook the heavens. A goddess of the mind, a warrior of restraint, a protector who never had to prove her power, because everyone could feel it. Athena, the virgin warrior, stood alone on Olympus. Not because no one wanted her, but because she belonged only to herself. Not all gods are loved equally, and not all cities are built on war. When the people of a fledgling city in Greece prepared to name their divine patron, two gods stepped forward to claim it. Poseidon, lord of the sea, rose first, trident in hand, eyes flashing like the deep. He struck the ground, and from the cracked earth surged a saltwater spring. Powerful, impressive, a gift of the sea. Then came Athena. No drama, no storm. She knelt and touched the soil. From her palm grew an olive tree, its branches strong, its fruitful, its roots deep, a symbol of peace, of wisdom, of endurance. The gods watched in silence. Poseidon's gift was a display of power. Athena's was a promise of life, and the people chose her. They named their city Athens, not after the sea, but after the goddess of wisdom. They did not want a ruler of tides and tempests. They wanted a guide, a protector, a mind to shape their laws, not just shield their walls. Athena became the soul of the city. She didn't just watch over its battles. She guided its culture, its schools, its debates, its architecture. She was present in their every choice, and in return they honored her not with bloodshed, but with brilliance. The Parthenon rose in her name, a temple of marble and symmetry, built with such grace that even the gods admired it. Inside stood her statue, not soft or smiling, but poised and ready, spear in hand, shield at her side, wisdom behind her eyes. She wasn't their queen. She was their example. The Athenians didn't worship her for her wrath. They worshipped her for her restraint. They saw in her the kind of power that listens before it strikes, the kind that defends but never dominates, the kind that builds, teaches, and lasts. And so, while many gods ruled from above, Athena walked among minds. She became the heartbeat of a civilization that would outlive empires, a city born not from conquest, but from a tree, a goddess chosen not for fear, but for hope. And that choice would echo through history. Because Athena didn't just win a city, she inspired one. In the quiet town of Lydia lived a girl whose hands danced with thread. Her name was Arachne. She wasn't noble. She wasn't divine. She was a mortal girl with a loom and a gift so breathtaking it drew whispers from far and wide. Her tapestries shimmered with color, with life. Gods and mortals alike stood still before her work. And that eventually became the problem. Pride crept in quiet, tempting, as it always does. Arachne began to say it aloud. My work is better than Athena's. Some warned her, others begged her to stop. But Arachne smiled and kept weaving. Up on Olympus, Athena heard. The words stung, not because they questioned her power, but because they insulted her purpose. Athena wasn't just the goddess of wisdom and war. She was the goddess of crafts, of skill, of the silent art that shaped civilizations. And Arachne, this girl with no temple or title, dared to call herself her equal. So Athena came down. She disguised herself as an old woman and warned Arachne directly. Humble yourself. Give thanks. Say that your gift was from the gods. But Arachne didn't bow. She met the goddess's eyes and said, if she thinks she's better, let her prove it. Athena dropped her disguise and accepted the challenge. 2 looms, 2 hands, 1 contest. They wove side by side, the air thick with silence. Athena's tapestry showed the glory of Olympus, Zeus ruling, Poseidon roaring, herself standing proud in victory, each thread perfect, each image divine. Arachne's showed the truth. Zeus deceiving women, Apollo chasing nymphs, the gods cruel, jealous, petty. And it was flawless. Not a single error. Even Athena, in her divine heart, knew the girl had woven perfection. But truth can wound deeper than insult. Athena didn't scream. She didn't smite. She touched Arachne gently and turned her into a spider, not out of wrath, but out of mercy, a creature that would weave forever. No pride, no applause, just silk and silence, and the memory of what had been. And so the first spider spun her web under moonlight, and the goddess of wisdom turned away, not with hatred, but with respect and sorrow. Because she had not crushed a rival, she had honored a mirror. Athena never wore her armor for decoration. Every piece had a story. Every symbol had teeth, but none more so than her shield, the Aegis. A shield so fearsome, so divine, it didn't just protect, it terrified. Etched upon its center was a face twisted in rage and agony, the head of a creature once feared by all Medusa. But how did a Gorgon's face come to rest in the hands of a goddess long before it became a weapon? It was a tragedy. Medusa had once been beautiful, a mortal priestess in Athena's temple, with hair like woven night and a face that turned heads. But beauty is dangerous in the world of gods, and Poseidon, lord of the sea, took her by force in Athena's temple. It was a violation of sanctuary, a desecration, and Athena, furious not at Poseidon, but at the shame left behind, transformed Medusa. She turned her into a Gorgon, hair into serpents, eyes into weapons, a face that turned all who looked upon it into stone. And then years later, a hero came. Perseus, young and brash, was sent to slay Medusa, but he could not do it alone. Athena gave him her shield, polished to a mirror shine, so he would not have to look at Medusa directly. She guided his strike, watched as the blade severed the head, And when it was done, she took the Gorgon's face for herself. Why? Was it revenge? Was it cruelty? Or was it something else? She placed Medusa's severed head upon her shield, not as a trophy, but as a warning. A symbol of terror, yes, but also of pain, of consequence, of what happens when violence walks unchecked, even in sacred places. The Aegis became more than protection. It was a reminder that wisdom is not always soft, that justice sometimes wears a monstrous face, that even gods carry guilt they do not speak of. When Athena raised her shield in battle, her enemies saw not just a goddess, but the haunting face of rage turned inward, of sorrow twisted into strength. And they ran not from Athena, but from what she had chosen to carry, because even wisdom has ghosts, and she wore hers in plain sight. Athena was a goddess of strategy, justice, and restraint, but even she could not stop fate. In the city of Troy, war smoldered like kindling before the spark. The gods had taken sides, tempers flared, and soon the greatest war of the ancient world consumed east and west alike. Athena stood with the Greeks, not because she loved bloodshed, but because of a single broken oath. Paris of Troy had judged Aphrodite more beautiful than her. Still, even in war, Athena sought to guide rather than destroy. And in that chaos there was one mortal she favored above all others, Achilles. He was unmatched on the battlefield, quick-footed, fire-forged, a storm in human form. But Athena didn't love him for his fury. She admired his mind. Beneath the rage there was reason, a warrior who could think. She whispered strategy into his ear, holding his shield when he faltered, even restrained his hand when wrath nearly overtook him. In every clash, her influence sharpened his instinct. But Athena knew what Achilles did not. He was doomed. He had been offered a choice. Live a long life in obscurity, or a short one remembered forever. He chose the latter. Glory in exchange for peace, memory in exchange for time. And Athena could not change that. She stood by as the war dragged on, each day bloodier than the last. She watched as Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, wore his armor and fell beneath Trojan spears. She felt the scream Achilles let loose when he learned of his death, the kind of scream that tears not just the air, but the soul. Achilles returned to battle like a man already dead. Athena did not try to stop him. She armed him, strengthened him, then let him go. He would kill Hector. Yes, he would burn brighter than any hero before him. But soon he too would fall, struck down not by brute force, but by fate's cold hands. And Athena, goddess of wisdom, a war of reason, could only watch. She had guided him, protected him, even loved him in her own divine way. But she could not save him. Because not even gods can undo the choices mortals make, especially the ones that bring them glory and ruin. While other gods demanded worship, Athena offered humanity something else. Tools. She didn't give fire. That was Prometheus. But she gave knowledge of how to shape it, how to use it, and how to turn chaos into civilization. She wasn't a goddess of the hunt or the harvest. She was the goddess of craft, of invention, of hands that build, minds that design, and eyes that see possibilities in stone, cloth, and wood. She taught mortals to tame horses, not just to ride them, but to yoke them, to guide them, to turn wild power into plowed fields and pulled wagons. She showed women how to weave, not just for beauty, but for survival, warmth, shelter, pattern art. She gave them the olive tree, a gift more profound than gold or silver. It bore fruit to eat, oil to cook and anoint, wood to carve and burn. A tree that asked for patience and returned it 100-fold. While other gods gave weapons, Athena gave instruction. Where Ares screamed into war, she built city walls, designed battlements, taught generals how to think before striking. She didn't end the conflict. No god could, but she taught mortals to wage it intelligently with purpose. To the Greeks, she was more than divine. She was practical. The goddess who didn't float above their lives, but walked among their choices, whispered into the ears of blacksmiths, guided the hands of architects, shaped not just their faith, but their future. She inspired the first philosophies, the first blueprints, the first laws, justice with a spine, wisdom with a sword. And unlike gods who gave gifts in anger or lust or pity, Athena gave hers in love. Not the warm, sentimental kind, but love rooted in belief and potential. She believed mortals could be more than animals, that they could build something lasting, something wise. Her temples didn't ask for blood. They asked for thought. Athena's gifts weren't miracles dropped from the sky. They were seeds. And in time, those seeds would become cities, poems, laws, and stories, including this one. Because even now, when we choose reason over rage, discipline over chaos, thought over impulse, we are still living in the world Athena imagined and gave to us. Time wears down even the greatest of gods. Olympus, once the center of the world, faded. Temples crumbled, statues weathered in the wind. New empires rose. New names were spoken in prayer. And yet Athena remained. Not in marble, not in myth and mind. While other gods became legends of passion, thunder, or jealousy, Athena became something else, an ideal, a symbol not of what we are, but of what we strive to be: justice without cruelty, power without corruption, intelligence without arrogance. She never ruled mortals by fear. She guided them through reason. And when the gods themselves fell silent, her voice, quiet, measured, unwavering, echoed in every courtroom, every school, every city built on thought instead of violence. Athena's strength was never in brute force. It was a legacy. She lived on in philosophies, not battles and questions, not orders, in books, not swords. The owl, once her companion, became a symbol of clarity and vision. Her olive tree stood not just in Athens, but in every civilization that valued law and thought, and her spirit whispered through the pens of Plato, the blueprints of Da Vinci. The quiet rebellion of every girl who dared to speak her mind in a world that told her not to. Because Athena was never just for the battlefield. She was for the builder, the thinker, the one who holds the line when everyone else reaches for a blade. In every era, her image returned, reborn not as a goddess, but as an idea. A woman in armor, head high, eyes sharp, refusing to be silenced. And each time she was different. And each time she was the same. Even now she waits in every mind that asks, is there a better way? Not louder, not faster, wiser. The myths may fade, the temples may fall, but wisdom that survives. And if you listen closely, when the world rages, when reason feels like a dying ember, you may hear her voice again. Not shouting, not weeping, just thinking. Athena was not born to rule Olympus. She was born to outlast it. Before the golden god of music or the silver-eyed huntress ever took a breath, their mother was hunted. Leto was no queen of Olympus. She was a Titaness, gentle, wise, and quiet. But she caught the eye of Zeus, and when she became pregnant with his twins, the sky held its breath. Two divine children not yet born already stirred the world. Hera, Zeus's wife, saw red. Not just because of the betrayal, Zeus's infidelity was as constant as thunder, but because this time the children were powerful, destined. One boy, one girl, Apollo and Artemis. So, Hera did what only a goddess could do. She cursed the earth itself. No land beneath the sun would offer Leto sanctuary. No city would take her in. No nation, no island, no resting place. Wherever she went, the ground turned hard. The wind spat dust, doors slammed shut. Even the animals turned away. Leto wandered, barefoot and swollen with life, through mountains and deserts, through whispers and fear. Every breath was tight, every step agony. Her body ached with two gods growing inside her, and yet she could find no place to rest. And behind her, something moved. A shadow, a hiss. Python, the monstrous serpent, born of Gaia herself. A guardian of the old oracles. A creature so vast that it draped across mountains like a living robe. Sent, some say by Hera, others say by fate. Whatever the truth, it hunted her. It slithered behind her across rivers and ridges, its tongue flickering, its eyes always watching. Not to kill her, not yet, but to make her suffer, to make her run. The earth rejected her. The gods stayed silent, and still Leto kept walking. She held her belly, whispering to the children within, promising them life, promising they would rise, no matter how the world tried to crush them. She was not a warrior. She carried no weapon, but she carried gods. And in her silence there was defiance. The twins were coming. Light and shadow, sun and moon, and even the cursed soil would tremble the moment they opened their eyes. Leto was at the edge of collapse. She had wandered the known world. Her feet blistered, her breath shallow. No land would hold her. No temple would take her in. Not even the animals laid in her path would stay. They scattered, warned off by the hearer's curse. But then came a whisper of a place. A drifting island, rootless, floating Delos. A barren rock, forgotten by most gods, tossed in the Aegean Sea like a stone skipped by the Titans. It had no wealth, no army, no shrine. It was too small to matter. And that made it perfect because Delos was not fixed to the earth. It wasn't bound by the curse. Leto arrived under a pale sky, her knees buckling. She collapsed on its stony surface and clutched her belly. The pain of labor was near. The twins stirred, impatient, divine. Delos trembled, not in fear, but in choice. The island, so often overlooked, so often adrift, made a decision that would echo for eternity. It anchored itself. The roots of Delos pierced the seabed. It locked into place, became land, became home, just long enough. And that was rebellion, a quiet, impossible defiance against Hera herself. The island gave Leto its only olive tree for shade. Its cliffs shielded her from the serpent Python, who circled but could not reach. And there, alone except for a few nymphs and the wind, she gave birth. First came Artemis, the huntress, the silver maiden, emerging in silence, calm and wise, even as a newborn. She didn't cry. She watched, and then, after 9 more days of pain, Leto gave birth again to Apollo, radiant as sunrise, glowing with golden light. His cry echoed like music across the waves. The twins were born, and the curse had been broken. Delos was no longer just a drifting rock. It was now sacred ground, the birthplace of gods, and though it had nothing to offer, not temples, not power, not gold, it gave the one thing no other place dared, sanctuary. And in doing so, Delos became immortal. Because sometimes greatness begins not with strength, but with compassion and a choice to shelter those the world has cast aside. They were born together, but they were not the same. Artemis arrived first, quiet as a shadow beneath leaves. Her eyes wide, calm, ancient. Though a newborn, she carried herself like a goddess who had seen the world already and found it wanting. She was the moon before it learned to shine, and when her brothers struggled to enter the world, she waited, watching her mother cry out in pain. 9 days passed, and then, with a wail that split the horizon, Apollo was born, his skin gold-tinged, his hair radiant, his eyes fierce. Where Artemis had whispered into the world, Apollo sang his way in. His very breath hummed like strings plucked by the fates themselves. The gods watched from afar. They had not dared intervene during Hera's curse. But now, as they saw the newborn twins on Delos' rocky shore, they felt something shift. These were not ordinary gods. They were prophecies wrapped in swaddling cloth. Even as infants, the twins showed their nature. Apollo's first laugh sent birds into flight. Light bent toward him. Flowers opened in his direction. Artemis reached for the shadows, her fingers tracing the curve of a bough only she could see. The moon itself, distant and cold, seemed to tilt in curiosity. Together they were balanced, sun and moon, clarity and quiet, rage and grace. Leto held them. Weak from her long suffering but victorious, her pain had been her offering, and the gods she bore were her answer. Apollo grew fast, his limbs strong, his voice sure. Artemis, beside him, grew in silence, watching, always watching. But they both knew something waited, something still hunted. Python, the ancient serpent, still slithered through forests and caves, sensing the gods who had escaped him. And Apollo, though barely grown, already felt the pull of destiny. The fire in his chest wasn't just light, it was vengeance for his mother. For every mile she had walked in agony. He was not born to run. He was born to face what others feared. And Artemis, she would walk at his side. The hunt had not begun, But the twins were ready, because sometimes power is not in being born first. It's in choosing who you protect. Far from Delos, nestled between cliffs and whispering laurel trees, sat the ancient sanctuary of Delphi. Even before Apollo's birth, Delphi had been sacred, a place where the earth murmured secrets and mortals came crawling for glimpses of fate. But its wisdom didn't come freely. It was guarded by Python, born of Gaia herself. Python was no ordinary beast, not a mindless serpent. He was primordial, a hulking creature of scale and shadow, older than Olympus, older than prophecy itself. He coiled around the slopes of Mount Parnassus, eyes burning like coals, fangs dripping venom strong enough to rot mountains. He didn't speak, but his presence silenced all. Even the gods tread carefully near Delphi. Python did not answer them. He served the deep earth, and beneath his heavy coils, the oracle of Gaia whispered only to those he allowed near. But Python had grown restless. He had failed to stop Leto, had watched her escape with her divine children. Now word reached him that the boy, the glowing son of Zeus, was rising, and Python knew this was no longer about revenge. It was about survival. For centuries, he had ruled Delphi. Mortals feared him. Spirits obeyed him. But the world was changing. The old gods were fading. And the boy god, Apollo. He was not coming to worship. He was coming to claim it. Back on Delos, Apollo heard the stories. The priests spoke in awe, the nymphs in fear. But Apollo didn't tremble. He listened. He learned. Python was a guardian. A tyrant dressed in the skin of tradition, and Apollo, still young but no longer a child, felt it in his bones. Delphi was meant for him, not just because he was powerful, but because he would bring clarity where Python had brought fear. The oracle would be freed, the serpent would fall. But this wouldn't be a battle of equals. It would be the first time a new god challenged an ancient force face to face, and in that clash, the world would feel the turning of an age. The sun was rising, and it would shine on blood. Apollo was still young, but the fire in him burned ancient. He stood beneath the olive trees of Delos, staring toward the horizon, not with childish wonder, but with the eyes of a god preparing for war. His golden hair caught the wind, his fingers twitched, not in fear, but in focus. He would not wait for Python to strike again. He would go to Delphi, but not with thunder, not with armies, with a bow. The gift came not from Zeus, nor forged in Olympus's fires. It came from Hephaestus, the smith god who saw potential where others saw youth. He crafted it polished, gold and silver inlaid with truth, a weapon not of chaos, but of precision. Apollo accepted it in silence. His hand curved around a grip like it had always been his, and when he drew the string, the air itself tightened. He practiced in the groves, far from Delos' eyes, not to impress, but to prepare. Each shot was a vow, each arrow a question to the universe. Are you watching? Artemis watched. Always. She too carried a bow now. Slender, silver, moonlit. She didn't speak much, but when she did, it was sharp. You only get one chance, she told him. Not unkindly. Python isn't a beast. His memory. He's afraid. Apollo nodded. Then I'll be precise. He wasn't chasing glory. He wasn't driven by pride. He was thinking of his mother, of the serpent that had hunted her. Over the years, Python had darkened the oracle's mouth. He did not want to kill a creature. He wanted to cleanse the place it poisoned. He was a god of light, and light reveals the moment arrived. The sun crested the sea in a halo of fire. Apollo stood at the shore, bow in hand, quiver across his back. Not armored, not crowned, just steady. Delos held its breath. Artemis reached out once, brushing his shoulder not to stop him, but to let him know she would remain. He set out alone to Delphi, to the mountain, to the coils of fate wrapped in shadow and venom. And though he walked as one, he carried the wrath of a sun, the promise of a god, and the silence of a hunter. The bow would sing soon, and the world would change its tune. Apollo arrived at Delphi not as a guest, but as a reckoning. The cliffs rose high above him, scorched by sun and scarred by time. Laurel trees whispered warnings. The wind trembled, and in the distance, Coiled around the sacred stones, Python waited. The serpent knew he was coming. He felt it in the shift of the earth, in the nervous rustle of birds, in the way the light no longer avoided the caves, but crept inward. This was no mortal child. This was the beginning of the end. Apollo didn't charge. He walked. His bow gleamed in the morning light. Each footstep echoed not just in the stone, but in history. Python uncoiled slowly, deliberately, the size of 10 chariots, muscles rippling beneath scales, dark as storm clouds. His eyes burned not with rage, but with warning. "I am older than your name," Python hissed. "I have coiled around this earth since it breathed." Apollo raised the bow. "I'm not here for your age," he said, calm and unshaken. "I'm here for your shadow." The first arrow loose was light itself. It struck Python's flank with a flash, burning through scale and hide. The serpent screamed, a sound that shook valleys and startled clouds. But Python was not so easily undone. He struck back, snapping trees, shattering boulders, venom hissing through the air. The ground quaked beneath his fury. But Apollo was faster. He moved like sunrise, sharp, silent, inevitable. Arrow after arrow flew. Each one sang, each one landed. But it wasn't just force. It was precision. Apollo didn't aim for the heart. He aimed for the corruption, the rot in the roots of Delphi, the fear Python had woven into the stones. Python lunged, fangs bared wide, but Apollo leapt, spun, and loosed a final arrow through the serpent's open mouth. Silence. Then the mountain exhaled. Python collapsed, coils folding in upon themselves, his shadow peeling back from the land like night before dawn. And with that, Delphi was free. The oracle stirred. The wind lightened. The laurel trees lifted their leaves to the sun. Apollo lowered his bow, not in triumph, but in understanding. He hadn't just killed a monster. He had cleared the path for truth to speak again, and the world would never forget his name. Delphi was quiet after the serpent fell. The cave still echoed with Python's last breath. The rocks, once slick with venom, now shimmered with dew. The very earth beneath the temple stones felt lighter, as if some ancient weight had finally lifted. But the most profound change wasn't in the silence. It was in the voice that followed. Deep within the sacred chamber where shadows had long ruled, the oracle stirred. Not the old voice of Gaia, not the cryptic whispers twisted by fear, but something new, clearer, warmer, a thread of fire wrapped in thought. Apollo had claimed Delphi, but he didn't seize it with chains or walls. He didn't sit on a throne or demand worship. Instead, he offered the world a gift, a place where truth could speak through his oracle, Pythia, a mortal woman chosen not for beauty or lineage, but for spirit. She would sit at the temple's center, inhale the vapors from deep within the earth, and speak what the gods saw, visions not of terror, but of clarity. Answers yes, but never without mystery, because truth is never given. It's earned. Word spread quickly. Kings traveled for weeks to kneel before her. Warriors came to ask if their battles would end in glory or doom. Farmers came to ask when to sow. Philosophers came to ask if the gods truly listened. And above them all, Apollo stood not visibly, but present. His music hummed through the laurel leaves. His warmth lingered in the stone, and in the Pythia's eyes there was always a flicker of sunlight not born from this world. The oracle of Delphi became the beating heart of Greece, not because it gave power, but because it demanded thought. Apollo had slain the monster, yes, but his greater gift was this. He had replaced fear with reflection, and in doing so, he rewrote what it meant to be a god, not just to punish, but to illuminate. Because light, once unleashed, never hides again, and Delphi, bathed in that light, would never belong to shadows. While Apollo stood bathed in triumph, Artemis remained in the silence of the woods. She had not followed him to Delphi. She had not lost arrows at Python. That battle was his destiny, his reckoning, and she honored it by staying where she was strongest in the wild. But she felled it. The moment the final arrow struck, the moment the oracle opened its eyes, the moment the serpent's shadow shriveled beneath her brother's light, She stood barefoot on a cliffside as dawn broke, watching not just the sunrise, but Apollo rise, her twin, her flame, the other half of her celestial balance. She did not smile nor cry. She simply watched with the quiet pride of a goddess who knows her part is different, but no less divine. For Artemis, the wild was her temple. Where Apollo's light struck cities, her shadows danced in groves. Where he guided oracles, she guided instincts. Where he brought clarity, she brought intuition. They were never meant to walk the same RD, but they were meant to rise together. As Apollo claimed Delphi, Artemis wandered further into forests untouched by man. She whispered to wolves. She taught deer to run silently. She wrapped herself in moonlight and sharpened her silver bow. She was not forgotten in the wake of her brother's fame. In fact, mortals feared her more. They called to her, not with songs, but with offerings left on stone. They saw in her the eyes of judgment, the silence before justice. Young women prayed for her protection. Hunters asked for her blessing before the chase. Midwives spoke her name in the hour of birth. And she answered, not with fire, but with presence. Where Apollo's legacy would shine through temples and prophecy, Artemis would be felt in wind and instinct, in paths not taken, in the way danger hesitated when she watched. She did not need Delphi. She had the wilderness, and as her brothers stood upon sacred stone embraced by priests and kings, Artemis raised her eyes to the moonless sky and whispered a truth only she could know. You've lit the world, brother. I'll guard its silence. And thus the balance was born. Sun and moon, voice and stillness. Twin gods rising always side by side. Apollo, god of music, poetry, and light, so often remembered for beauty and brilliance, was not without shadows beneath the lyre's golden home. And the warmth of his truth burned a temper hotter than the midday sun. His wrath, when stirred, was not wild like Ares or cruel like Hera. It was precise, surgical, unforgiving. The world would soon learn. Apollo did not forget a slight. When mortals mocked the gods, they risked many things. But mocking Apollo's art was unwise beyond measure. Marsyas learned that too late, a satyr with a flute of bone. Marsyas stumbled upon the instrument once discarded by Athena. He played it well, too well. So well, in fact, that he dared challenge Apollo, the god of music, to a contest. A mortal, a goat-legged trickster, daring to duel with a god. Apollo accepted in the contest. Marsyas played first, wild and full of soul. The forest bent toward the notes. Birds paused mid-flight. Even the stones seemed to sway. Then Apollo played. The sound was like light itself, clear, blinding, divine. But he didn't stop there. He flipped his lyre, played it upside down, and sang while strumming. Then he looked at Marsyas. Can you do both? He asked. Marsyas could not, and Apollo did not forgive. The god who had spared Python showed no such mercy here. He flayed the satyr alive, string by string, in a cave where the echoes still carry screams. The gods watched. Some turned away. Even Artemis, the huntress, frowned. But Apollo's face never changed. There was no pleasure in the punishment, only the cool certainty of justice as he saw it. Because while Apollo gave light to the world, he demanded respect in return. Delphi would be a place of truth, but also of discipline. Mortals came for wisdom, yes, but they left with warnings. Do not lie. Do not boast. Do not forget that beauty, when challenged, can burn. Apollo was the god of harmony, but disturb that harmony, and he would become the storm. He wasn't cruel by nature, but he would never allow the world to forget that even the sun can scorch. Apollo could heal, but he could also destroy. And when mortals forgot this, he reminded them not with fire, not with arrows, but with disease. The war at Troy had raged for years. Heroes clashed, gods took sides, and blood soaked the beaches like rain. But it wasn't swords or spears that brought the Greeks to their knees. It was Apollo's wrath. Agamemnon, the proud Greek king, had taken a captive, Chryses, daughter of a priest who served Apollo. When her father begged for her return, offering gold and prayers, Agamemnon laughed and turned him away. That was his mistake. The priest lifted his hands to the sky. Apollo answered, He descended not in glory, but in silence, a god unseen but unmistakable. He walked the Greek camp as a shadow, his silver bow in hand, and with every pull of its string, another soldier fell, not pierced by arrows, but struck by fever. Death came quietly, without fanfare. The dogs howled. The air thickened with the scent of rot. Day after day, warriors collapsed, too weak to lift their shields. Horses moaned, fires burned, untended. The army begged their seers for answers, and they all pointed to the same god, Apollo, the healer, the bright one, the protector of oracles and bringer of plagues. Agamemnon had insulted him, and now his men were paying the price. Only when the girl was returned, unharmed, unbought, did Apollo lift his hand. The sickness passed, but the memory did not. Because this was the truth of Apollo. He wasn't just light and harmony, he was balanced. If mortals crossed the line, if justice was mocked, if sacred oaths were broken, he responded not in rage, but in correction. And unlike other gods, Apollo didn't scream. He acted quiet, certain, and devastating. The Greeks afterward continued to pray to him for health, for music, for guidance, but always with a whisper of fear, because they knew now what few dared to speak aloud, that the God who cured the sick could also choose not to. And when the sun disappears behind a storm, it's not the dark that frightens you, it's knowing who put it there. The war ended, the temples aged, but the names Apollo and Artemis remained, etched not just in stone, but in the rhythm of life itself, for they were never meant to be gods who ruled by force. They guided me. Artemis remained in the wilderness, untouched by palace or crown. Maidens whispered her name in moonlight. Hunters left tokens at the forest's edge. Mothers prayed to her in labor, begging for mercy or strength. She answered with silence, with instinct, with presence. She did not need temples. Her sanctuary was the wild and Apollo. He became the golden thread in civilization's tapestry. His music shaped the lyre's first song. His voice spoke through the oracle at Delphi for 1,000 years. Poets, sculptors, doctors, lawmakers, each looked to him not for fire or miracles, but for clarity. He was not the god who forced your hand. He was the god who lit the path and left the choice to you. Together, the twins embodied balance. Where Apollo brought law, Artemis brought instinct. When he revealed the truth, she protected the mystery. Where he warmed, she cooled. Where he stood in gold, she moved in silver. They never ruled Olympus, but they shaped it. More than that, they shaped mortals because their power wasn't just in what they gave, but in what they withheld. Artemis never tamed the wild. She let it remain wild. Apollo never answered every prayer. He let mortals question. And through that, they created something rare among gods: growth. They weren't just protectors. They were mirrors, reflecting back the best and worst in those who worshipped them. And to this day, when a child feels the thrill of moonlight on skin, when a musician finds melody in silence, when a seeker kneels at a crossroads asking not for rescue, but for insight, twins are still there, one watching from the trees, the other humming just behind the sun. Because gods may fade from temples, but they do not fade from the heart. Especially not the ones born in exile who chose to become something more than worship. They became part of us forever. Long before there were textbooks, hospitals, or genetic science, there were only human eyes, watching, wondering, interpreting the world through myth, emotion, and instinct. In this distant past, the arrival of a child who looked or behaved differently evoked deep, often spiritual reactions. We don't have written accounts from these ancient times describing what we now call Down syndrome, but archaeology gives us rare, moving glimpses. In 2014, a team of researchers in France uncovered a 1,500-year-old burial site. Among the remains was a young child with distinct cranial features matching those of Down syndrome. This child, despite their differences, was buried with care, not cast out or discarded, but laid gently to rest in the same sacred manner as others in the community. It's a small detail, but a powerful one. What it suggests is that long before medical terms were invented, some people responded not with fear, but with acceptance. In a world without diagnosis, perhaps this child was simply seen as a quieter soul. Maybe they were carried more often, spoken to more softly. Maybe they were loved, not in spite of their differences, but because of them. In other ancient cultures, physical and intellectual differences were often interpreted through a spiritual lens. Some were revered as having a special connection to the divine. Others, sadly, were misunderstood, feared, or shunned. Without a framework to understand conditions like Down syndrome, the reaction largely depended on the culture, the time, and the temperament of the surrounding people. The fact that we found more than one ancient burial like this, including possible cases in ancient Rome and the Andes, tells us something quietly profound. People with Down syndrome have always been part of the human family. Always. Their presence is not a modern phenomenon. It is not a flaw to be corrected or a problem to be solved. It is part of the natural diversity of life, a thread woven into the human story since the beginning. These ancient burials whisper to us across time. They say, I was here, I mattered, I was not forgotten. And as we journey deeper into history, we'll see how that whisper was sometimes drowned out, and how it slowly found its voice again. As we step into the classical world, ancient Greece, Rome, Egypt, India, and beyond, we enter civilizations rich with myth, philosophy, and symbolism. In these societies, difference wasn't always interpreted medically. Instead, it was often understood through metaphor, religion, and mystery. People who looked or acted differently were often cast in symbolic roles. Some were seen as touched by the gods, vessels of divine will, omens, or cosmic messengers. Others were viewed with suspicion, seen as signs of imbalance, impurity, or ancestral sin. In either case, individuals with cognitive or physical differences were rarely just people. They were symbols. This was the world before genetics, before science. So if a child was born with Down syndrome, soft facial features, slower speech development, a gentler demeanor, their presence might spark stories rather than diagnoses. Some cultures believed such children were blessed, closer to the spirit world. Others feared they carried bad luck or divine punishment. In Egyptian and Greco-Roman traditions, myths included tales of children born under strange stars or touched by divine forces. There's no clear reference to Down syndrome in these texts, but they reflect a worldview where difference was interpreted as fate or prophecy. Sometimes that brought reverence, sometimes exile. What's important to remember is this. There is no single way of responding. In some villages, a child with visible differences might be raised in the heart of the home, watched over with gentleness. In others, they might be hidden, excluded, or abandoned. Everything depended on the culture's worldview and the hearts of the people nearby. For example, in some ancient Hindu texts, children born with certain characteristics were seen as manifestations of karmic cycles, lives returning in new forms to teach, to heal, or to be healed. While this didn't always translate to inclusive care, it did offer a framework that acknowledged spiritual value in every soul. Still, the truth remains. Without medical understanding, people with Down syndrome were largely left vulnerable to superstition and social control. They weren't yet seen as fully human in the modern sense, not in rights, not in protection, and not in opportunity. They lived on the edges of society, sometimes elevated, sometimes feared, but rarely understood. And that misunderstanding would linger for centuries. Reinforced by religion, cloaked in folklore, and later repackaged by science, the Middle Ages brought with them a cloak of silence, especially for those who lived outside the boundaries of what society considered normal between the 5th and 15th centuries, as Europe transitioned from ancient empires to feudal kingdoms. The treatment of people with intellectual disabilities became increasingly shaped by religious dogma, social hierarchy, and fear of the unknown. Children born with Down syndrome in medieval Europe entered a world ruled by strict beliefs. The church held immense influence, and deviations from the norm were often interpreted through a lens of sin and punishment. A child who did not speak like the others, who learned slowly, or who had distinct facial features might be seen not simply as different, but as evidence of divine disfavor, or worse, demonic influence. In rural villages, news of such a birth could spread quickly. Whispers would fill the streets. Was it the mother's fault? Has the family sinned? Was this child a punishment, a test, or a warning? Because there was no scientific framework to explain genetic conditions, imagination filled the void. and imagination, when guided by fear, often leads to cruelty. Many of these children were hidden from view. They might be raised quietly at home, kept indoors, rarely seen in public. Some were given over to monasteries or convents, where the religious were tasked with caring for the sick and the vulnerable. In some cases, this offered safety, food, shelter, and a quiet life in others. It meant institutional isolation, far from family or affection. But the medieval world wasn't entirely heartless. There are fragments of compassion tucked within these centuries. Certain religious orders saw every soul as sacred, regardless of ability. There are recorded instances of monks referring to people with intellectual disabilities as innocent, spiritually pure, closer to God in those rare cases. Kindness was extended, even if full inclusion remained out of reach. Still, for most, this was an age of silence. Without language to describe Down syndrome, without community support or advocacy, families were left to navigate the unknown alone. Their stories went unwritten, their lives mostly undocumented. They were always present, but history passed them by, leaving only traces in artwork, parish records, or burial sites. And yet, even in this shadowed age, they endured quietly, waiting for a world that could one day see them clearly. Though the medieval period is often remembered for its cruelty toward those who were different, not every story is one of fear, rejection, or superstition. Hidden among the darker pages of history are moments of quiet compassion, acts of care that defied the norms of the time, and reveal the enduring humanity of the people who lived it. In small communities and remote villages, families sometimes responded to a child born with Down syndrome, not with shame, but with acceptance. These were not people with access to science or support systems. They were farmers, craftspeople, mothers, and fathers, responding not as scholars, but as parents. And for some of them, love won over fear. We know this from rare records of midwives, healers, and religious figures who wrote of gentle or slow children who were deeply cherished by their families. In monasteries where many with disabilities were placed, either by choice or necessity, some religious caretakers developed relationships that transcended societal expectations. A monk or nun might teach such a child simple prayers, provide consistent meals, or simply offer the tenderness of presence. In these isolated cases, people with Down syndrome were allowed to grow, however slowly, at their own pace. They may not have been schooled in the traditional sense, but they were included in daily rhythms, helping in gardens, participating in worship, or assisting with household tasks. Their value wasn't measured by productivity, but by being. We also find hints of compassion in art. Medieval paintings occasionally depict figures with features resembling Down syndrome, often as angels, shepherds, or humble saints. Whether the artists were intentionally portraying individuals with a condition, or simply inspired by those they knew, the message endures. They were part of the human story, and sometimes even part of its beauty. Of course, we can't romanticize this era. These acts of kindness were not common policy, but exceptions to a harsher rule. Most individuals with Down syndrome still faced exclusion, mockery, or invisibility, but the exceptions matter. They remind us that even in the most rigid and fearful times, there were always people willing to see differently. People who looked past superstition and status. People who chose to care not because they had to, but because something in them refused to do otherwise. And in these simple, defiant acts of compassion, the future began to take root. As Europe emerged from the medieval period and stepped into the scientific curiosity of the 17th and 18th centuries, the way society viewed people with disabilities began to shift. Faith and superstition slowly made room for observation and classification. It was the dawn of modern medicine, and with it came a new kind of attention: the medical gaze. For centuries, individuals with Down syndrome had existed on the margins, whispered about, cared for in silence, or ignored altogether. But in 1866, a British physician named John Langdon Down changed that. Working at the Royal Oldswood Asylum for Idiots in Surrey, he published a paper titled Observations on an Ethnic Classification of Idiots, in which he described a group of patients who shared certain distinct features: almond-shaped eyes, a rounder face, a shorter stature, and gentle behavior. He didn't know the cause. Chromosomes hadn't been discovered yet, but he saw a pattern. And so, unintentionally, he gave the world the first medical description of what we now call Down syndrome. His language, however, reflected the prejudices of his time. Langdon Down compared his patients to people of Mongolian ethnicity, a term he used based on outdated racial theories that were sadly common in Victorian science. He called the condition Mongolism, a label that would linger painfully for over a century. Though offensive by today's standards, it's important to recognize that Langdon Down's intentions weren't rooted in cruelty. In fact, compared to many of his peers, he believed in humane care. He emphasized kindness, structure, and dignity for his patients, even as the system they lived in remained deeply flawed. With his paper, something both powerful and problematic began. People with Down syndrome were now seen as a type, diagnosable category. This had consequences. On one hand, it allowed researchers to study the condition, eventually leading to medical advances. On the other hand, it reduces individuals to a diagnosis, a set of traits, an object of study. For the first time, people with Down syndrome were no longer invisible, but now they were being watched, analyzed, classified, their humanity still often overlooked. Still, this moment marked a turning point. The road to understanding had begun, and though that road would pass through some very dark places in the years to come, it also laid the groundwork for discovery, advocacy, and eventually empowerment. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the industrial world was booming. Cities were expanding, technology was advancing, and systems were being built to organize nearly every aspect of human life. Among these were institutions, sprawling facilities designed to house people who didn't quite fit the mold of a rapidly modernizing society for individuals with Down syndrome. These institutions became both a refuge and a prison. Families, especially those in working-class communities, were told by doctors, clergy, or local officials that their child will be better off in a specialized facility. These institutions promised safety, structure, and expert care, but the reality was often far grimmer. Many of these places were overcrowded, underfunded, and severely lacking in trained staff. Children with Down syndrome were placed alongside individuals with vastly different conditions, from mental illness to severe physical disabilities. There was little personalization, even less understanding, and almost no opportunity for growth. Residents wore uniforms, followed rigid schedules, and had little say in their daily lives. For decades, this system was seen as progressive. In fact, some families believed they were doing the right thing, sparing their children from the stigma and struggle they might face in the outside world. But for the children themselves, the experience was one of disconnection. They were removed not only from society, but from their families, their communities, and often their sense of self. Institutionalization also allowed the broader public to ignore the existence of people with Down syndrome. Out of sight became out of mind. Schools didn't adapt, workplaces didn't accommodate, and the myth persisted that these individuals couldn't learn, couldn't grow, and didn't belong. There were exceptions, of course. A few institutions offered genuine care, where staff treated residents with patience and warmth. Some children formed lasting friendships, even family-like bonds, with one another and with the rare caregivers who saw their value. But these were islands of light in a sea of systemic neglect. Perhaps the most heartbreaking part of this era is how many bright, kind, and capable individuals lived their entire lives behind locked doors. Not because they were dangerous, but because the world wasn't ready for them. This chapter in history is a sobering one, but it's also a setup because the tide would eventually turn and the people once hidden away would begin to step into the light, not alone, but with their families, advocates, and a voice the world could no longer ignore. As the 20th century unfolded, science and medicine continued to progress, but not always in the right direction. What should have been a time of growing understanding for people with Down syndrome became instead a period where cold theories and dangerous ideologies stripped away humanity. This was the age of eugenics, born out of a misguided desire to improve the human race. The eugenics movement took hold in many parts of the world. It wasn't confined to fringe thinkers. It was embraced by governments, doctors, universities, and public health campaigns, all under the pretense of science. People with Down syndrome were labeled as unfit, defective, and a burden on society. The logic was chilling. If certain traits were seen as undesirable, then perhaps they could be prevented or eliminated through sterilization, institutionalization, or selective breeding. And so, in countries like the United States, Canada, Sweden, and the UK, laws were passed that allowed the forced sterilization of individuals with intellectual disabilities. Many young women and men with Down syndrome were unknowingly or forcibly sterilized without consent, often under the guardianship of the state. They were denied the right to parenthood, to family life, or even to basic bodily autonomy. The very things that make us human, love, connection, choice, were systematically denied. But nowhere was this ideology more violently applied than in Nazi Germany. Under Adolf Hitler's regime, the concept of a pure race took on horrifying consequences. The so-called T4 program targeted children and adults with disabilities, including Down syndrome, for extermination. Thousands were taken from their families and murdered in clinics masquerading as hospitals. Some were starved, others were poisoned by gas or lethal injection. Their deaths were hidden in bureaucracy, listed as pneumonia or heart failure. Their names were erased, their existence declared life unworthy of life. These acts were not crimes of war. They were policy, and they were carried out in the name of progress. This chapter in history must never be forgotten. It is a brutal reminder of how easily science, when divorced from ethics and compassion, can be used as a weapon. But even in those darkest days, there were people, parents, nurses, quiet resistors, who fought to protect these lives, who saw their worth, who whispered the truth the world refused to hear. They are the ones who planted the seeds of the resistance that would follow in the heart of Nazi Germany, beneath the rhetoric of purity and strength. Lay one of the most sinister chapters in the history of disability, the T4 program, a state-sponsored euthanasia operation that specifically targeted children and adults with disabilities, including those with Down syndrome. It began quietly. Letters were sent to German families asking them to bring their disabled children to special clinics for better treatment, education, and care. Parents, hopeful and desperate, believed they were doing what was best, but once the children arrived, they were never seen again. The T4 program was named after the address of its headquarters, Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin, and its mission was terrifyingly clear: eliminate lives deemed unworthy. Doctors, nurses, and bureaucrats collaborated to carry out mass murders of the disabled. This was not done in secret. It was done with medical forms, sign approvals, and official stamps. Systematic, efficient, sanitized. Children with Down syndrome were among the first victims. They were often the youngest, the most visibly different, and the most vulnerable. Some were killed within days of arrival. Others were kept for observation, studied like specimens, and then euthanized. Their families were sent falsified death certificates. Causes of death carefully altered to avoid suspicion. The deception was as cruel as the act itself. By the time public outcry forced the official end of the T4 program in 1941, over 70,000 people had been murdered. But the killing didn't truly stop. It continued in smaller, less visible forms throughout the remainder of the war. This was not war in the traditional sense. These victims were not soldiers. They were not political enemies. They were children in cribs, teenagers with bright smiles, adults who loved music or colors or stories. They were people with Down syndrome whose lives were deemed too inconvenient, too costly, or too different to protect. The legacy of T4 cast a long shadow. It showed the world just how dangerous it is when society forgets the dignity of every human life. It wasn't just a Nazi crime, it was a human crime, one enabled by silence, stigma, and the belief that some lives matter more than others. But out of that darkness, something began to stir, an awakening. The world, horrified by what had happened, began to ask deeper questions about inclusion, ethics, and the meaning of care. It would be a long road to healing, but the reckoning had begun. In the aftermath of World War II, as the world reckoned with the unimaginable horrors of the Holocaust, something began to change slowly, quietly, but undeniably. The global community had seen in stark and brutal terms what happened when entire groups of people were devalued, dehumanized, and discarded. And while this reckoning initially focused on race and religion, it soon extended to people with disabilities, including those with Down syndrome. The moral shock of the T4 program ignited a movement. Parents who had once been told to give up their children, who had been pressured to institutionalize or stay silent, began to speak out. They were no longer willing to accept a life of confinement and shame for their children. They began to organize, first in small community groups, then in national organizations. In the United States, the 1950s and 60s saw the birth of advocacy movements like the National Association for Retarded Children, now the ARC, which gave families a platform to demand dignity and rights. These early advocates were not politicians or celebrities. They were mothers and fathers. They were people who loved their children deeply and refused to believe that a diagnosis like Down syndrome meant a life without value or purpose. They began to challenge outdated laws, push for better medical care, and demand access to public education, which at the time was denied to most children with intellectual disabilities. The civil rights era provided momentum. As marginalized groups across America fought for equality, disability advocates began to connect their cause to the broader movement for justice, the idea that every person, regardless of race, gender, or ability, deserved equal treatment under the law became a rallying cry. Across the ocean, similar movements emerged. In the UK, Scandinavia, and Australia, parents formed support networks and began to lobby governments. Advocates started publishing newsletters, holding conferences, and creating training programs for teachers and caregivers. A sense of solidarity began to form not just among parents, but among self-advocates. Individuals with Down syndrome who began to speak for themselves. This shift was monumental. It moved people with Down syndrome out of the shadows and into the public conversation. And while progress was far from perfect, a powerful truth had been planted. They had voices, they had potential, and they would no longer be silent. The age of advocacy had begun. As the advocacy movement grew in the 1960s and 70s, something remarkable happened. The people at the heart of the story, individuals with Down syndrome themselves, began to speak not just through their families or support organizations, but in their own words, their own actions, and their own lives. This was the decade when silence truly began to break. In many countries, new legislation started to open the doors of public schools to children with intellectual disabilities in the United States. The Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975 guaranteed the right to a free and appropriate public education for every child, including those with Down syndrome. This marked a seismic shift. Children who were once kept out of classrooms were now being welcomed in, often for the first time in history. With education came visibility. Children with Down syndrome were no longer hidden away. They were learning alongside their peers, making friends, participating in school plays, attending dances, and building confidence. Teachers, many of whom had never worked with a child with an intellectual disability before, discovered something unexpected. These students had so much to offer. They were capable of learning, growing, and contributing, not just to the classroom, but to the school community as a whole. This visibility extended beyond the classroom. As social norms evolved, people with Down syndrome began to appear in magazines, on television, and eventually in film. In the UK, a groundbreaking documentary aired in 1979 called A World Apart, which followed the life of a young woman with Down syndrome. It was raw, honest, and deeply humanizing for many viewers. It was the first time they had seen someone with a condition portrayed with dignity and depth. Families, too, continued to share their stories. Personal essays, memoirs, and photo essays began to circulate, showing everyday moments of joy, frustration, growth, and love. These stories didn't sugarcoat the challenges, but they shattered the myth that life with Down syndrome was only sorrow or struggle. And most importantly, self-advocates began to rise. Young adults with Down syndrome started giving speeches, attending conferences, and sharing their experiences. Their message was simple but powerful. We are not less, we are different, and we have something to say. This chapter in history marks the birth of visibility, when the world was finally forced to look, to listen, and to begin seeing people with Down syndrome not as cases, but as human beings. By the 1980s and 1990s, the growing chorus of advocacy, education, and self-expression began to reshape not only public policy, but public perception. A new understanding of Down syndrome was taking root, one that viewed individuals not as problems to manage, but as people to include, support, and celebrate. This shift was driven by several forces coming together at once. Medical advancements were improving health outcomes. Educational reforms were increasing inclusion, and most importantly, a generation of children with Down syndrome who had been born into a world of advocacy instead of silence were growing up in full view of society. Medical care played a key role in this transformation. Pediatricians began receiving better training on developmental disabilities. Heart surgeries, once considered too risky or unavailable for children with Down syndrome, became more routine, dramatically improving survival rates. Therapies like speech, occupational, and physical therapy were being offered earlier and more consistently, helping children develop skills that were once considered unreachable. As a result, life expectancy began to climb. In the 1960s, many children with Down syndrome were not expected to live beyond their teens. But by the 1990s, that number had risen dramatically, reaching into the 50s and 60s. With some individuals living well into old age, for the first time in history, people with Down syndrome were not just surviving childhood, they were becoming adults with full lives ahead of them. This new reality forced society to ask deeper questions. What kind of adulthood would they have? Could they work? Could they live independently? Could they marry? The answers increasingly were yes. Supported employment programs began connecting adults with Down syndrome to meaningful jobs in grocery stores, offices, hotels, and even businesses started by self-advocates themselves. Housing cooperatives and group homes allowed for semi-independent living, and across the world, stories began to emerge of romantic relationships, marriages, and deep friendships formed between people who just decades earlier might never have had the chance to meet one another, let alone dream of a future. It was becoming clear people with Down syndrome were not defined by their condition. They were individuals with strengths, struggles, personalities, and dreams. And the world, slowly but surely, was learning how to make room for them. By the early 2000s, something truly beautiful was happening. Individuals with Down syndrome, once hidden away in institutions or quietly raised at home, were stepping into the spotlight. Not for pity, not for tokenism, but for the same reasons anyone steps forward to be seen, heard, and recognized for who they are. Representation was no longer limited to medical journals or advocacy newsletters. People with Down syndrome were appearing in commercials, modeling campaigns, and television shows. And even on stage, for the first time, audiences around the world were seeing the joyful, complex, and deeply human reality of living with Down syndrome through the voices and stories of those who lived it. In 2009, a young woman named Madeline Stewart from Australia made global headlines when she became one of the first professional models with Down syndrome. Her photographs weren't just beautiful, they challenged fashion's long-standing standards of beauty. Madeline walked runways in New York, Paris, and London, inspiring thousands and shifting what was considered normal in the modeling world. In Spain, Pablo Pineda became the first person with Down syndrome in Europe to earn a university degree. He didn't just succeed academically, he became an educator, public speaker, and ambassador for inclusion. His visibility helped dispel one of the oldest myths surrounding the condition: the belief that people with Down syndrome could not think deeply, study, or contribute intellectually. Television shows began featuring characters played by actors with Down syndrome, not as side notes, but as fully developed roles. In the US, Lauren Potter starred in the hit series Glee, bringing visibility and confidence to a new generation of viewers. Her advocacy, both on and off screen, helped normalize what had once been misunderstood. But this wasn't just about fame. It was about everyday visibility. People with Down syndrome working in bakeries, greeting customers at hotels, living in apartments, and celebrating birthdays with their communities. It was about classmates, co-workers, neighbors, and friends. Representation mattered because it gave people with Down syndrome a mirror, a way to see themselves in the world. And it gave the rest of society a window into their world, one filled with humor, love, ambition, and individuality, from hidden to seen, from misunderstood to embraced. This was the power of presence, and the world was watching, finally, with open eyes. Despite all the progress in medicine, advocacy, and visibility, the journey toward full inclusion for people with Down syndrome is far from over. Today we live in a world of both celebration and contradiction. While many societies have taken meaningful steps forward, Others still struggle to accept, support, or even recognize the value of lives that don't fit into conventional expectations. One of the most sensitive and complex issues is prenatal screening. With advances in genetic testing, many expectant parents around the world now have the option to know early in pregnancy whether their child might have Down syndrome. And while information can be empowering, it can also lead to difficult decisions, especially in cultures where disability is still feared or misunderstood. In some countries, particularly in parts of Europe and Asia, termination rates following a prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome are alarmingly high, reaching over 90% in some regions. This raises deeply emotional questions. Are these choices truly free? Or are they shaped by societal pressure, lack of support, and fear of the unknown? Many parents have shared that they were given the diagnosis in cold clinical terms, with a long list of risks but little mention of joy, growth, or possibility. Few were introduced to families raising happy, thriving children with Down syndrome. Fewer still were told about the growing community of adults living fulfilling, independent lives in this silence. Fear grows. The issue isn't about judgment, it's about understanding. The truth is, many societies still haven't made space for people with Down syndrome to be fully included in education, employment, housing, or relationships. Too often, parents are left to navigate these systems alone, and children are still met with lowered expectations, limited access, or subtle exclusion. There's also the challenge of tokenism. Representation is growing, but sometimes it's treated as novelty instead of normalcy. A few success stories are celebrated loudly, while many still live on the margins unseen. And yet, in the face of these challenges, the movement continues. Advocates, including people with Down syndrome themselves, are pushing for better policies, deeper inclusion, and a cultural shift toward true acceptance because the ultimate goal isn't just awareness. It belongs. A world where no one with Down syndrome is seen as a mistake, but as a life worth living, loving, and lifting up. When we look back across the centuries of the silence, the stigma, the rejection, and the resistance, one truth rises above all the noise. Every life has meaning. This isn't just a belief. It's a fact that history, time and again, has quietly tried to prove. Even when society refused to see it, people with Down syndrome have always been part of the human family. From ancient burial sites to medieval villages, from the cold halls of 19th century institutions to the red carpets of the 21st century, they have been here, living, laughing, struggling, surviving, teaching. What they have offered the world isn't always loud or glamorous. It's quieter, but no less powerful. Their lives often radiate gentleness, honesty, and emotional intelligence. Many who live or work with individuals with Down syndrome speak of a rare kind of sincerity, a disarming warmth that can shift an entire room, not because they're inspirational, but because they are present, real, and deeply human. We must resist the temptation to romanticize or flatten their experiences. A person with Down syndrome, like anyone else, is complex, capable of joy, frustration, ambition, sadness, and love. Their lives are not without challenge, but they are not defined by limitation. They are not symbols of purity or tragedy. They are individuals with their own voices, stories, and agency. And their presence in this world reminds us of something vital. Humanity is not measured by IQ, productivity, or perfection. It is measured by connection, by kindness, by the capacity to love and be loved. When we say that every life has meaning, we're not offering charity. We're stating a universal truth, one that applies to us all. Because if a person needs to prove their worth to deserve life, none of us are safe. But if we start from the belief that worth is inherent, that every person matters just because they are, then we begin to build a world where everyone truly belongs. People with Down syndrome don't need our pity. They need our presence, our partnership, our willingness to listen, adapt, and make space. Their lives are not side notes in history. They are chapters in a human story, and some of the most beautiful ones at that. So how are people with Down syndrome treated throughout history? The honest answer is layered and complex, a story of sorrow and silence, but also of resilience, revolution, and love. For much of recorded history, they live in the shadows, misunderstood in ancient myths, hidden away during the medieval period and objectified under the cold gaze of early medicine. At times they were feared, at times forgotten, and in the darkest moments, like during the eugenics movement in Nazi Germany, they were targeted simply for existing. Yet they endured not just as victims of history, but as active participants in it, through the families who fought for them, the teachers who believed in them, and eventually through their own voices rising to say we are here, we matter. The story of people with Down syndrome is not just a medical or social history, it's a human one. It reflects how we as a society define dignity, who we protect, who we prioritize, and what we believe makes a life valuable. In recent decades, we've seen a transformation that would have once seemed unimaginable. People with Down syndrome graduating from schools, working jobs, acting in films, falling in love, advocating for their rights, and shaping their communities from exclusion to celebration. The arc of this journey speaks not only to their strength, but to our collective potential to evolve. But this progress did not happen by accident. It came from love, fierce, stubborn, and persistent love, from parents who refused to accept silence, from doctors who chose empathy over protocol, from educators who saw ability where others saw deficit, and from people with Down syndrome themselves who lived authentically in a world that often underestimated them. That legacy of courage, presence, and perseverance is still being written today. As we close this journey through history, may we carry forward the lessons it offers to question inherited prejudice, to uplift the unheard, and to recognize that the value of a person is never up for debate. People with Down syndrome are not anomalies in the human story. They are threads in its very fabric, woven with grace, endurance, and the quiet power of being fully, unapologetically alive. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, consider liking the video and subscribing for more human-centered history, and tell me where you're watching from and what time is it. I'd love to know who's with us tonight. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and take care long before the invention of writing. Before kingdoms were carved into stone or temples rose under the sun, humans felt the urge to adorn themselves. Jewelry, in its raw primal form, may be one of the oldest expressions of human identity. It began not with gold or diamonds, but with what nature offered: shells, bones, teeth, stones, feathers. The oldest known pieces of jewelry were discovered in a cave in Morocco. 33 perforated nacreous shells believed to be over 100,000 years old. Threaded together as beads, they were likely worn as necklaces or anklets. They may seem simple to our modern eyes, but these were revolutionary artifacts. They signaled a leap in symbolic thinking, the ability to represent status, group affiliation, or spiritual belief through objects worn on the body. In prehistoric cultures, jewelry was not made for vanity. It was communication. A necklace of animal teeth might suggest a hunter's prowess. A string of shells could symbolize fertility, trade, or kinship. In many early burial sites across Europe and Africa, skeletons are found with ornaments placed carefully around the neck, wrists, and ankles, evidence that jewelry played a role in rituals of death and remembrance, guiding souls into the afterlife or marking them as members of a sacred lineage. Even among nomadic and tribal communities, where survival was the primary concern, time was devoted to crafting adornments. Pieces were shaped, polished, engraved, pigments were applied. These acts show us that jewelry wasn't frivolous. It was central to the human experience, a way to carry meaning, memory, and magic. What's especially fascinating is that this early jewelry emerged independently in different parts of the world. From Siberian mammoth ivory bracelets to African ostrich shell beads, cultures separated by oceans and language all turned to ornamentation. Why? Because jewelry satisfies something universal. The need to belong, the need to express, the need to transform the body into something more than just flesh and bone. Long before precious metals and royal crowns, jewelry was deeply human, a silent language of identity, protection, beauty, and belief. It was our first sparkle, and from that first glint of a bead strung through twine, an entire world of adornment was born. As early human societies evolved into great civilizations, so too did the art of jewelry. In the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia, gold became not just a metal, but a language of power and prestige. Artisans of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon crafted intricate pieces from gold, silver, and precious stones like carnelian, lapis lazuli, and agate. Jewelry adorned not just the living, but the statues of gods as offerings in temples glistening with sacred light. Mesopotamian jewelry was deeply symbolic. Spiral motifs represented eternal life, while geometric patterns spoke of cosmic order. Women of high status wore elaborate headdresses, bracelets, and pendants, often buried with them to ensure continuity in the afterlife. These items weren't mere accessories. They were extensions of divine favor, political power, and cultural sophistication. Meanwhile, in the rich sun-drenched land of Egypt, jewelry reached an even deeper spiritual resonance. Gold, abundant in Nubia and treasured by the Egyptians, was considered the flesh of the gods, incorruptible, eternal, and sacred. Every piece worn by a pharaoh or priestess was crafted with purpose to protect, to invoke, to transform. Amulets held immense importance. The scarab beetle symbolized regeneration and rebirth. The ankh, shaped like a cross with a loop, represented eternal life. The eye of Horus, worn close to the heart or forehead, was believed to ward off evil and ensure health and restoration. These talismans were inlaid with vibrant stones, turquoise, lapis, garnet, each selected not just for beauty, but for its energetic and spiritual properties. Jewelry also reflected social status. Gold collars, broad pectorals, and inlaid rings told stories of wealth, lineage, and divine association. Children wore protective charms. Animals were sometimes adorned with collars bearing inscriptions. Even the dead were wrapped in layers of symbolic jewelry, from toe caps to headdresses, ensuring their safe journey into the next world. In both Mesopotamia and Egypt, jewelry wasn't an afterthought. It was woven into the fabric of religion, governance, and personal identity. It marked the wearer as chosen by gods, by kings, or by fate itself. This era set the stage for what jewelry would continue to be: a shimmering extension of the soul, a coded language of beauty, power, and protection forged in fire, polished by belief. As civilization blossomed around the Mediterranean, jewelry evolved into an art form that married personal beauty with civic identity. In ancient Greece and Rome, adornments were not only reflections of wealth, but declarations of taste, philosophy, and even patriotism. The Greeks believed in harmony, not just in architecture and sculpture, but in the human form itself. Jewelry was designed to complement the body, enhancing natural elegance rather than overpowering it. Gold wreaths shaped like olive branches adorned the heads of both gods and mortals. Earrings and bracelets featured detailed repoussé work, often depicting mythological scenes. Athena with her owl, Aphrodite rising from the sea, or Eros, the god of desire, clutching an arrow. Gemstones became more prominent, but they were prized not only for color, also for meaning. Carnelian was believed to calm anger, amethyst protected against intoxication. Engraved gems, called intaglios, were used as personal seals, pressed into wax to sign documents. These pieces held not just beauty, but identity and authority. In Rome, jewelry became even more widespread and opulent. With the expansion of the empire came access to exotic materials: pearls from the Persian Gulf, emeralds from Egypt, sapphires from Sri Lanka. Roman women, especially of the upper class, wore layers of adornment from elaborate fibulae brooches that held their garments together to rings on nearly every finger. Men, though more restrained, still wore signet rings and amulets, often inscribed with protective symbols or family crests. Jewelry in Rome also crossed the lines of class. Freed slaves, once given citizenship, would wear gold rings as a mark of their new status. Soldiers returning from conquest often bore spoils of war in the form of jewelry, not just for personal use, but as offerings to the gods. But it wasn't all vanity. Many items were worn for protection. Ebola. A locket worn by Roman children held amulets to guard them from evil spirits. Even emperors believed in the power of charms. Tiny figures of Hercules, serpents, and phallic symbols were worn under togas, hidden but believed to be potent. For the Greeks and Romans, jewelry was more than an accessory. It was a biography. Each piece told a story of lineage, a virtue, a belief. It announced who you were, what you valued, and sometimes who you prayed would protect you. While the Mediterranean world shaped jewelry through aesthetics and empire, the East, particularly India, forged a path where adornment became inseparable from spirituality, ritual, and the rhythms of life itself. In India, jewelry was not merely decorative. It was sacred. It was symbolic. It was, and still is, part of the soul's language. From the Indus Valley Civilization around 2500 BCE, archaeologists have uncovered beautifully detailed bangles, nose rings, and bead necklaces crafted from carnelian gold and faience. Even then, Indian artisans showed extraordinary skill and an intuitive sense that jewelry was not just worn, it was lived in. Unlike the West, where jewelry often indicated wealth alone, in India it served as a kind of visual scripture, telling stories of love, fertility, protection, and divinity. Gold was and remains the most revered material. It's associated with Lakshmi, the goddess of prosperity, and considered pure, auspicious, and eternal. Women often receive gold jewelry at birth, during marriage, and as part of inheritance, not just as gifts, but as security, spiritual armor, and a symbol of their worth. Each part of the body had its own sacred ornament. Mangtika for the forehead, believed to stimulate the sixth chakra, jhumkas for the ears, anklets that sang with every step, and toe rings that symbolized marital status. Bangles worn in pairs were said to bring harmony to a woman's energy, while nose rings linked her to sensuality and strength. But Indian jewelry wasn't limited to women. Kings wore gem-studded turbans, jeweled armlets, and rings that carried the weight of dynasties. Warriors went into battle with talismans tied around their necks or wrists, pieces blessed by priests to bring courage or ward off death. In other parts of the East, such as China and Southeast Asia, jade became the stone of immortality. It was more prized than gold, believed to preserve the spirit and harmonize the body. Dragons, phoenixes, and lotus flowers were carved into pendants worn from birth until death, and often buried with a wearer to guide them into the next world. Across the East, jewelry was and remains a form of prayer, power, and poetry. It speaks without words, protects without swords, and decorates not just the body, but the journey of life itself in medieval Europe. Jewelry took on new forms and new meanings, shaped by a world torn between the splendor of royalty and the solemnity of religion. This was a time when crowns were considered divine symbols, when rings sealed fates and alliances, and when even the humblest pendant could carry the weight of a prayer. As Christianity spread across Europe, jewelry evolved from pagan amulets to sacred symbols of faith. Crosses became common pendants, worn to protect and to proclaim devotion. Relics, fragments of saints' bones, pieces of holy cloth, even drops of what was believed to be Christ's blood, were encased in ornate reliquaries and worn close to the heart. These were not just objects of beauty. They were considered spiritually charged, capable of healing or intercession. Monasteries and churches commissioned goldsmiths to craft elaborate chalices, bishops' rings, and rosary beads strung with pearls or jet. Every piece served a function to inspire awe, demonstrate piety, or signify authority. Jewelry was no longer just personal. It had become political and theological. In royal courts, jewelry was a statement of lineage and legitimacy. Crowns, scepters, and brooches were embedded with sapphires, rubies, and emeralds, not just for beauty, but for symbolism. Sapphire stood for wisdom and divine favor, ruby for courage and passion, emerald for fertility and rebirth. Kings and queens used these gems like language, crafting a message with every stone. Feudal lords exchanged rings to seal oaths of loyalty. Knights were given jeweled tokens, sometimes a lady's brooch or a locket to carry into battle, worn over armor as both a charm and a symbol of their cause. Rings of mourning, too, became common, engraved with names and dates worn in memory of lost loved ones, their sentiments sealed in gold. Among the rising merchant class, sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what. Jewelry became a visible boundary between classes, pearls for the elite, base metals for commoners. But even among peasants, simple adornments persisted. A copper ring, a braided cord with a carved bone charm. They might not shine like a royal ruby, but they carried just as much meaning to the wearer. In the medieval world, jewelry was no longer just about wealth or beauty. It had become a vessel of belief, a tool of allegiance, and a bridge between the earthly and the divine as Europe emerged from the shadows of the Middle Ages. The Renaissance swept across the continent like a rebirth of light. In this era of rediscovery, of science, art, and individualism, jewelry was elevated to an entirely new plane. No longer just symbolic or devotional, it became a statement of intellectual sophistication, artistic patronage, and personal elegance. The wealthy elite, nobles, merchants, and rising dynasties began to commission custom-made jewelry from master goldsmiths. These artisans, inspired by classical antiquity, fused techniques from ancient Rome and Greece with the innovations of the day. Enameling flourished. Colored gemstones were arranged in elaborate symmetrical designs. Goldsmiths became artists in their own right, working in collaboration with painters, poets, and architects. Portraits from the 15th and 16th centuries show nobility adorned in delicate chains, jeweled hairnets, and neck pieces set with rubies, sapphires, and pearls. Jewelry wasn't merely decorative, it was a coded language. A locket could contain a lover's portrait or a lock of hair. A brooch might feature allegorical figures, Cupid for love, the phoenix for rebirth, or the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail to symbolize eternity. Religious jewelry still had a place, but it became more personal. Less institutional, tiny devotional pendants etched with saints or biblical scenes were hidden inside elaborate designs. Rosaries were strung with gold and coral beads, carried as much for status as for prayer. The Renaissance also saw the emergence of the gemstone as more than a symbol. It became a centerpiece. Cutting techniques improved, and gem merchants traveled far and wide to acquire diamonds from India, emeralds from Colombia, and pearls from the Persian Gulf. These stones weren't just worn. They were marveled at, written about, and even passed through courts as diplomatic gifts. Women's jewelry was layered and opulent, girdles hung with trinkets, earrings with dangling pearls, collars thick with gems. Men wore chains of office, jeweled rings, and ornamented sword hilts. Jewelry became a wearable canvas, a blend of identity, aspiration, and artistry. In the Renaissance, beauty was divine, and jewelry, worn close to the body, became a way to express the divinity in gold, stone, and form, not as a whisper of status, but as a radiant, undeniable declaration of self. As the Renaissance gave way to the Baroque era, jewelry transformed once again, this time into a theatrical display of opulence, wealth, and global reach. From the 17th to the early 18th century, adornment became more dramatic, more extravagant, and more politically charged. Jewelry was no longer just a matter of taste. It was a proclamation of dominance, both personal and imperial. The courts of Europe, especially those of Louis XIV in France and the Habsburgs in Spain and Austria, embraced adornment as a performance. Necklines plunged, collars rose, and every exposed surface became an opportunity for decoration. Women wore bodices covered in gemstone clusters, while men draped themselves in heavy gold chains and gemstone-studded insignia. Hairpins, shoe buckles, gloves, and even fans were encrusted with precious stones. What fueled this explosion of glitter was more than just art. It was a conquest. European powers were now expanding across the globe. The riches of India, Africa, and the Americas flooded into royal treasuries. Diamonds from Golconda, emeralds from Colombia, and gold mined by colonized labor became the raw material for European luxury. Jewelry became a display of colonial power, the sparkling reward of imperial ambition. One iconic example is the famed La Peregrina pearl, discovered off the coast of Panama in the 16th century. It passed through the hands of Spanish royalty, Napoleon's brother, and eventually Hollywood icon Elizabeth Taylor. But behind its beauty lay centuries of conquest, labor, and cultural exchange. Baroque jewelry was not subtle. Brooches grew large and ornate, rings became miniature sculptures, and earrings often reached the shoulders. The scrolls, ribbons, and floral motifs of the period reflected the architecture and music of the time, ornate, layered, and bursting with emotion. Religious jewelry, too, reached new levels of complexity. Rosaries were set with diamonds. Reliquaries were made portable, worn as lockets filled with saints' bones and adorned with angels, doves, and golden thorns. Jewelry became both armor and altar. Yet beneath the shimmer, a new world order was forming. Trade, colonization, and the rise of the merchant class began to shift who could access luxury and who could no longer be ignored. The Baroque period wasn't just about showing off. It was about controlling the narrative in gold, in gemstones, and in spectacle. Jewelry told the story of who ruled the world and who paid the price for it. The 18th and 19th centuries were marked by upheaval. Revolutions toppled monarchies. The middle class gained power, and the Industrial Revolution reshaped how the world worked, dressed, and adorned itself. Jewelry, once the exclusive language of royalty and the church, began to evolve, becoming more democratic, more personal, and surprisingly, more romantic. In the wake of the French Revolution, ostentatious jewelry fell out of favor. Lavish displays of wealth could be dangerous. Simpler, neoclassical styles took hold, inspired by ancient Rome and Greece, a subtle nod to ideals of reason, equality, and restrained elegance. Think delicate cameos, laurel wreath motifs, and lockets worn under the collar close to the heart. But with the Victorian era came a different kind of extravagance, one not rooted in monarchy, but in sentiment. Queen Victoria of England set the tone for much of 19th century jewelry. Her love story with Prince Albert was immortalized in matching bracelets, mourning brooches, and lockets of hair. Jewelry became deeply emotional, an extension of love, grief, and memory. Engagement rings grew in popularity. So did birthstone jewelry and charm bracelets, each piece a fragment of one's personal story. Advancements in technology made jewelry more accessible. Mass production, electroplating, and machine-cut stones allowed the middle class to participate in trends once reserved for nobility. Costume jewelry emerged not fake, but fashionable, allowing people to express themselves affordably and often. Meanwhile, global influence continued to expand. Japanese motifs entered Western design during the Art Nouveau movement. Persian and Mughal designs inspired the flowing gem-drenched styles of elite ateliers. With colonization came both exploitation and cultural fusion, seeing the gemstones and aesthetics worn from Paris to New York. By the late 19th century, jewelry houses like Tiffany, Incamouse, and Cartier were rising to prominence. These weren't just stores, they were brands that would help define luxury for the new century. Their designs blended elegance with identity, offering pieces that felt timeless yet modern, refined yet emotional. Jewelry in this era became more than status. It became a wearable biography, celebrating births, mourning deaths, symbolizing unions, and even marking independence. And just on the horizon, a revolution in style and design was approaching, one that would change the face of jewelry forever. The 20th century shattered traditions and redrew boundaries in politics, in art, and most certainly in jewelry. From the Art Deco movement to St. Fashion, from the glittering red carpet to hand-woven tribal beads, jewelry became more than ornamentation. It became self-expression, a statement not just of status but of identity, resistance, and reinvention. The early 1900s ushered in the bold geometry of Art Deco. Inspired by industrial design, Egyptian archaeology, and Jazz Age glamour, this style celebrated clean lines, symmetry, and contrast. Platinum, onyx, and diamonds were favorites. Women wore long linear earrings and flapper-style necklaces. Men adorned themselves with cufflinks and tie bars. It was a celebration of modernity, jewelry for a world speeding into the future. World wars temporarily shifted fashion toward restraint, but post-war prosperity reignited sparkle. In the 1950s, Hollywood shaped jewelry trends. Stars like Marilyn Monroe and Audrey Hepburn made diamonds and pearls synonymous with elegance. Meanwhile, houses like Cartier, Van Cleef & Arpels, and Harry Winston became symbols of global luxury, merging royalty with celebrity. By the 1960s and 70s, jewelry began to reflect rebellion. The counterculture movement embraced handmade, spiritual, and nature-inspired pieces. Beads, leather, and turquoise became signatures of the free spirit. In contrast, the disco era of the 80s brought maximalism back. Gold chains, oversized earrings, and bold gemstones mirrored a decade of ambition and excess. Then came identity jewelry, pieces worn to say, "This is who I am." Pride pins, nameplate necklaces, zodiac pendants, political brooches. Jewelry became a canvas for culture, belief, gender, and belonging. It told a world where you stood, who you loved, or what you survived. In recent years, the conversation around jewelry has expanded to include sustainability, ethics, and story. Lab-grown diamonds challenge old definitions of value. Heirloom redesigns give new life to family history. Artisan revival movements celebrate indigenous craftsmanship and community over mass production, and digital culture plays its part. A piece of jewelry today might trend on Instagram, be handcrafted by a local maker, or symbolize a cause close to the heart. No longer confined to gold or diamonds, jewelry is now as diverse as the people who wear it. It's not just about shine, it's about meaning. From Mesopotamian amulets to digital era signet rings, jewelry has always spoken. And as long as humans long to express who they are, it always will. On the shimmering coastline of southern Italy, not far from the chaos of modern Naples, there lies a place that once rivaled the grandeur of Rome itself, Baia. Today, it's quiet, partially submerged, and largely forgotten by time. But beneath its tranquil waters and weathered ruins, something extraordinary lingers. A chamber lost to the sea, carved deep into volcanic rock, shrouded in steam and legend. They call it the Oracle Tomb, and some whisper it may be a literal gateway to the underworld. To the ancients, Baia wasn't just a city. It was a sanctuary of pleasure and prophecy, vice and vision. It rested on the restless earth of the Campi Fleegor, the burning fields, a vast volcanic caldera where the ground shifts, breathes, and smolders. Gases hiss from cracks in the earth. Waters bubble unnaturally. It's a place where the physical world feels thin, as if something else lies just beneath it. For centuries, Baia served as a playground for emperors, generals, and poets. Lavish villas hugged the cliffs. Statues of gods and heroes overlooked private ports. But as the land sank and the sea rose, much of the city slipped underwater. The marble promenades and mosaic floors now lie beneath waves, preserved in silence, untouched by air, watched only by fish and the occasional diver. And yet, amid these submerged wonders, one chamber stands apart, partially underwater, hidden near the ruins of an ancient bath complex. It descends into darkness. It is no ordinary ruin. It was carved with intention, layered with symbolism, and aligned with something beyond architecture, something sacred or forbidden. To step into it today is to step into a different reality, one where myth might still breathe in the stones. Modern archaeologists gave it a name, the Oracle Tomb, but older voices called it something else, the Antrum, the cavern, a place where the veil between the living and the dead wore thin, where prophecy could be drawn from vapors, and where those brave enough could ascend not just into earth, but into the very imagination of ancient Rome. Whatever lies within, it does not rest quietly. The Oracle Tomb is waiting, and its story begins where the land vanishes beneath the sea. Baia was no ordinary Roman settlement. It was the empire's escape hatch, a retreat for emperors, aristocrats, and the privileged elite, built not for governance or warfare, but for indulgence. Nestled along the Bay of Naples, Baia glimmered with luxury, a city soaked in pleasure and veiled in scandal. To walk its marble streets was to brush shoulders with power. To bathe in its thermal springs was to immerse yourself in the rituals of both healing and hedonism. The city's fame was not merely due to its wealth, but its landscape built atop a restless volcano. Baia rose directly over the Campi Flegrei, a massive supervolcano whose energy heated the ground, bubbled its waters, and lit the air a strange metallic scent. The Romans called this region the breathing place of the gods. Here, the earth itself seemed alive, shifting, exhaling sulfur and whispering secrets through steam. It was here that Roman engineers and artists constructed magnificent bathhouses, domed pavilions, and private palaces that rivaled anything in the capital. Nero had a villa here. So did Julius Caesar and later Hadrian. These weren't just places of rest. They were scenes of politics, affairs, and decadence. It was said that what happened in Baia never left Baia. The city became so synonymous with excess that poets and moralists openly condemned it. Seneca the Younger called it a vortex of luxury. But Baia's geological beauty was its undoing. Over time, The volcanic activity that warmed its baths and inspired its mystique began to shift the land beneath it. A process known as bradycism, the rising and falling of the earth due to volcanic gas movement, caused entire sections of the city to slowly sink. By the late Roman period, the sea had claimed Baia's lower levels. Temples, gardens, and mosaic-covered floors now lie beneath shallow, glimmering waters, a surreal underwater museum. Divers today swim past marble columns and forgotten sculptures. What was once the seat of sensual pleasure is now eerily still, preserved by the sea like a sleeping ghost of empire. And it is here, among these sunken ruins and steaming fissures, that one structure remained hidden for centuries, a chamber untouched by time, carved into myth and said to be the entrance to the underworld itself. The Oracle Tomb of Bayer remained lost for nearly 2,000 years, buried beneath volcanic soil, shrouded by myth and ultimately forgotten. That is, until the mid-20th century, when a quiet yet extraordinary discovery was made by a man who wasn't a famous archaeologist, or a headline-seeking treasure hunter, but a British amateur explorer and civil engineer named Robert Paget. In the 1960s, Paget, along with his colleague Keith Jones and a small team of volunteers, began excavating a mysterious site near the ancient baths of Bayer, guided by ancient texts, geological surveys, and a sense that there was more beneath the surface than anyone realized. They uncovered a narrow stone-lined passage that descended deep into the hillside. The tunnel seemed unremarkable at first, just another example of Roman engineering. But as they pressed deeper, they began to notice strange features, deliberately carved bends, sudden drops in temperature, rising humidity, and finally a steeply descending passage flanked by benches carved into the rock. This was no aqueduct. It was ritualistic. The deeper they went, the more it resembled something sacred or forbidden. Their excavation revealed a carefully engineered journey downward, culminating in a chamber partially submerged in water. Sulphurous steam rose from the black pool. The air was thick, the visibility low, and there in the darkness was a sense of disquiet, as if the ancient stone itself remembered. Paget was convinced. They had found the legendary Antrim, the sacred cave described by ancient Roman writers, believed to be the domain of the Cumaean Sibyl, the prophetic priestess of Apollo. This was no tomb in the traditional sense. It was a portal, a constructed descent into the underworld where rituals of prophecy, initiation, and perhaps even necromancy had once taken place. The layout aligned eerily with classical accounts. Virgil, in his Aeneid, wrote of Aeneas descending into Hades near Lake Avernus, just miles from Baia. The Sibyl, he said, led him through a stifling cave of shadows and fumes. Now, Paget and his team had seemingly walked the same path. Though his findings were largely ignored by mainstream academia at the time, the Oracle Tomb of Baia remained one of the most haunting archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Not for what it proved, but for what it suggested that mythology, in rare moments, might leave behind a physical trail. To truly grasp the mystery of the Oracle Tomb, one must return to the world of Roman myth, to the stories whispered by poets, preserved by scribes, and feared by pilgrims. In this landscape of gods and shadows, one figure looms above all others in connection with the underworld, Cumaean Sibyl, according to legend. Sibyl was a priestess of Apollo who lived near Lake Avernus, a volcanic crater lake just a short distance from Baia. The Romans believed this lake was the actual entrance to Hades, the land of the dead. Fumes from the earth rose steadily from its banks, and birds were said to fall dead from the sky as they flew over its cursed surface. It was the perfect setting for a seer who claimed to speak on behalf of the gods and the spirits beyond. The Sibyl's prophecies were cryptic, often terrifying. She was said to enter trance-like states, intoxicated by volcanic vapors, her voice echoing through a sacred tunnel, a cave that descended into the earth. For centuries, scholars speculated where this legendary oracle once stood. Paget's discovery in Bayer offered a compelling answer. The structure he uncovered mirrors the descriptions found in classical texts. Virgil, writing in the Aeneid, described a dark passage, hot with the breath of the earth, where the hero Aeneas was led by the Sibyl to commune with the dead. He wrote of choking vapors, of silence broken only by the dripping of unseen water, and of the fearful hush that hung over the entrance to the underworld. The Oracle Tomb of Baia matches this imagery, not just in structure, but in sensation. Those who have entered the narrow passage speak of the oppressive heat, the chemical scent of sulfur, the disorienting darkness. At the tunnel's end, the water-filled chamber reflects any light like obsidian glass. Sound is muted, giving the space a tune like stillness. Was this the actual chamber where the Sibyl spoke, or was it a later Roman attempt to recreate a place of myth? Either way, it serves a chilling purpose. It materializes the metaphysical. It gives form to fear, space to the sacred, a physical descent that mirrors the spiritual one into the unconscious, into death, into prophecy. The Oracle Tomb doesn't just resemble the entrance to the underworld. It feels like it. The Oracle Tomb of Bayeux is not a structure of chance. It is a calculated experience. Every curve, descent, and chamber within its volcanic walls seems designed to lead not just the body, but the soul through transformation. To walk through it in ancient times was not a simple act of curiosity. It was a ritual. It was an initiation. It was a descent into mystery, governed by fire, steam, and water, the elemental forces of the Roman underworld as Robert Paget and his team explored the site in the 1960s. They began to see the tunnel not merely as an architectural marvel, but as a spiritual theater. The passage began gently, then twisted and narrowed, leading downward into thickening heat and darkness. Carved benches suggested that pilgrims may have paused to meditate or pray. The deeper one traveled, the more the environment changed. The volcanic heat intensified. The walls became slick with condensation. The air grew heavy with sulfur, the very breath of the chthonic world. The journey culminated in a final plunge. A hidden stairway led into a chamber, partially submerged in thermal water. The chamber itself was quiet, enclosed, and surreal, a pool that reflected light like ink. In ancient times, torchlight would have danced across the ceiling, illuminating the steam rising from the surface. The effect would have been otherworldly. A sensation of standing between realms immersed in both the physical and the metaphysical. Paget theorized that this pool may have represented the Styx, the river that in Roman and Greek myth separated the living from the dead. The ritual journey through the tunnel would mimic that descent, passing from light to shadow, from life to the threshold of death. Those who entered may have sought prophecy, absolution, or communion with the spirits of their ancestors, and then they would return slowly, retracing their steps, rising once again toward daylight. But they would not emerge unchanged. The experience would linger like smoke. They had touched the edge of something vast and unknowable. Whether or not they heard Sibyl's voice, they had entered a realm few dared approach. This wasn't tourism. It was a pilgrimage, and the forces that shaped the Oracle Tomb, fire, earth, and water, had also reshaped those who walked its path. The Oracle Tomb of Bayeux is not grand in scale, yet contains a profound architectural genius. What at first glance appears to be a simple volcanic passage reveals itself, layer by layer, to be a masterwork of symbolic construction, designed not for the living world, but for experience of death and return. The passage is roughly 400 feet long, but its psychological depth far exceeds its physical measurement. Robert Paget and his team were the first to notice that the tunnel was built with specific intention. It was not random, nor strictly utilitarian. The angles, chambers, and orientation suggested an initiation rite, not a public bath or tomb. Its form mimicked myth. The entrance begins innocently, allowing light to filter in, but almost immediately the path bends sharply, deliberately, removing the line of sight to the outside world. The air grows warmer, the passage narrower. Light fades. Each step becomes an act of trust in the structure and in whatever forces it was meant to invoke. Roughly halfway through the descent, the tunnel intersects with a vertical shaft, likely designed to carry hot gases upward from underground vents. Paget believed this was no accident. The shaft may have filled the tunnel with sulfuric vapors, enhancing the illusion of descent into another realm. To the ancient mind, these fumes were the very breath of the gods, intoxicating, disorienting, and sacred. From there, the tunnel curves again, leading to a narrow staircase descending into the final chamber, the so-called Oracle Pool. This room, partially submerged and sealed in darkness, could only be entered by stepping into the water itself. Some scholars believe a hidden priestess or attendant may have spoken from an unseen alcove, delivering prophecies in a trance-like voice, aided by the echo of stone and the distortion of steam. The architecture in this view. It was a kind of spiritual technology. It altered the senses, controlled the journey, and created the illusion, or perhaps the reality of divine contact. Like the Great Pyramids of Egypt or the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, this was a space built for transition between worlds. It wasn't meant to impress, it was meant to transform. The Oracle Tomb didn't just house rituals, it was the ritual carved into stone. The Oracle Tomb of Bea stands at a peculiar crossroads between archaeology and allegory, between physical ruin and immortal myth. It forces us to ask, where does history end and legend begin? The Cumaean Sibyl, long associated with the nearby cave systems of Cumae, is not just a mythological figure. She was recorded by Roman historians, feared by generals, and immortalized in literature, according to legend. She was granted a 1,000-year lifespan by Apollo, but forgot to ask for eternal youth. Over time, she withered, her voice echoing from deep within the earth, a prophetic whisper from the void. Her presence dominates this region. The Roman poet Virgil placed her at the center of the Aeneid's descent into the underworld. In that tale, the hero Aeneas approaches Sibyl, who guides him into Hades through a dark passage filled with poisonous vapors and sacred dread. The setting is near Lake Avernus, just a few miles from the site of Bayer's Oracle Tunnel. Paget's discovery, the dark descent, the sulfur fumes, the final chamber of water seems to mirror this literary descent too perfectly to ignore. Could this chamber have inspired the myths, or were the myths so deeply believed that the chamber was built in homage to them? Historians remain divided. Some see the tunnel as a sophisticated Roman ritual space, perhaps built to simulate the mythic journey, a kind of immersive religious theater for elite initiates. Others believe it may have had a more literal purpose, used by cult or priesthood to facilitate real oracular experiences induced by hallucinogenic gases and the powerful psychological effects of the environment itself. There is also the possibility that it was both. For ancient Romans, myth and reality were not separate domains. A temple didn't merely represent a god, it housed one. A cave didn't just resemble the underworld, it was the threshold. The people who walked into this tunnel thousands of years ago likely didn't see it as a metaphor. They saw it as an entry. And so the Oracle Tomb becomes more than a ruin. It is a memory that refuses to fade, a space that preserves the psychic terrain of a civilization that believed powerfully in what lay beneath. When Robert Paget and Keith Jones unveiled their findings in the 1960s, they did not receive the acclaim one might expect for uncovering a possible portal to the underworld. In fact, much of the academic world met their claims with skepticism, if not outright dismissal. Why? Because the Oracle Tomb didn't fit neatly into traditional categories. It wasn't a temple with inscriptions. It wasn't a tomb filled with artifacts. It lacked the grandeur of Pompeii or the documentation of Rome's civic structures. To many, it was just an odd tunnel carved into a hillside, a curiosity, not a revelation. And yet the structure's precision defied that label. Its design, temperature shifts, alignment with ancient literary descriptions and subterranean water chamber pointed to something more than coincidence. Paget's documentation was thorough, and his interpretation, while bold, wasn't without precedent. After all, sacred caves and prophetic passages are found throughout the ancient world, from Delphi to Eleusis. In recent years, a new generation of researchers has returned to Bayer with fresh eyes and advanced knowledge. Technology, ground-penetrating radar, underwater archaeology, and 3D mapping have begun to reveal the city's sunken secrets, including thermal bath systems, garden courtyards, and submerged mosaics still intact beneath the waves. The Oracle Tomb, once ridiculed, is now being reconsidered, not as fantasy, but as a functional space within a culture that lived within myth. Even skeptics must admit the engineering is deliberate. The environmental manipulation from heat and darkness to acoustics and vapor is purposeful. Whether it was built for a literal descent to Hades or to simulate one is now less important than this. It worked. Visitors would have felt changed by the journey. The tunnel shaped their senses, confused their orientation, and altered their state of mind. Whether through ritual, myth, or gas-induced trance, it brought them to the edge of something they couldn't name, and then LED them back again. In this sense, The Oracle Tomb mirrors all great spiritual experiences. It doesn't give answers. It poses a question, one etched in silence and stone. Is this myth made real or reality shaped by myth? Bayer's Oracle Chamber has not spoken in millennia, but even in its silence, it still challenges us to listen differently, to look deeper, and to wonder if the ancient world knew something we have forgotten. Today, the Oracle Tomb of Bea lies mostly forgotten by tourists, overshadowed by the more famous ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Its entrance is modest, unmarked by statues or triumphal arches. The tunnel disappears into the hillside like a secret, quiet, damp waiting. And yet those who step inside still describe the same sensation. A subtle tightening of the air, a hush that wraps around the senses like a shroud. Time has weathered its stone, but not its mystery. What makes this site so compelling, so eerily unforgettable, is not just its structure or its setting. It's the feeling it evokes that we are not merely observing history, but brushing up against something older than history, a doorway into the psychological heart of the ancient world, the Romans. With all their roads and legions still feared what lay beneath their feet. They built shrines over cave mouths and made offerings to the dead at the edge of volcanic craters. They named the entrance to the underworld Mundus, and every August they believed the spirits of the departed walked freely among the living. Bea, with its boiling springs and sulfur-scented air, embodied this liminal space, not heaven, not hell, but threshold. The Oracle Tomb is one of the few surviving places where that belief feels tangible. To descend its corridor is to join a lineage of seekers, pilgrims, emperors, and perhaps even the mad, all of whom came not to find treasure, but truth, or at least a glimpse of it. What do they hear in that chamber? What do they ask of the Sibyl? What price did they pay for prophecy? We may never know. And perhaps that's the point. In an age obsessed with proof, Bayer reminds us of something sacred, that some experiences were never meant to be fully understood. Some structures were built not to house answers, but to cradle questions safely, in silence and stone. So the Oracle Tomb remains part myth, part monument, part mirror, reflecting our eternal fascination with what lies beyond. It is a whisper carved into the earth, a ritual still alive in shadow, a gate that never fully closes. And for those who dare to enter, it still waits. She could flip, twist, or soar. Simone Biles had to survive. Born on March 14, 1997, in Columbus, Simone Ariane Biles entered a world marked by instability. Her biological mother struggled with addiction. And Simone, along with her siblings, was placed in and out of foster care. There were moments of separation, uncertainty, and upheaval. For most children, such an environment can be overwhelming. But even in these early, fragile years, Simone's spark began to flicker. That spark found its fuel when she was just 3 years old. Simone and her siblings were taken in by their maternal grandfather, Ron Biles, and his wife, Nellie, a nurse and businesswoman. Eventually, Ron and Nellie officially adopted Simone and her sister Audria, giving them not just legal guardianship, but safety, structure, and unconditional love. To Simone, they were never stand-ins. They were in our mom and dad. It was in their Houston, Texas home that Simone's new life began to take root. One day, during a daycare field trip to a local gym, young Simone saw something that lit her up inside. Tumbling mats, spring floors, and athletes flipping through the air like it was second nature. She couldn't sit still. She mimicked the moves on the sidelines until a coach handed her a note suggesting she be enrolled in classes. That note changed everything. Simone's natural abilities were apparent almost immediately. She had explosive power, an uncanny sense of balance, and what coaches later called air awareness. The rare ability to always know where her body was mid-flight. But more than that, she had a relentless work ethic and an unmistakable joy when she moved. Gymnastics wasn't just an activity, it was where she came alive. By the age of 6, she was training seriously. By 8, coaches whispered about her potential. She was still a little girl, small, quiet, with a shy smile. But on the mat, she was fearless. Her past was turbulent, her future uncertain. But gymnastics gave her control, focus, and purpose. Simone Biles wasn't born into privilege. She was born into adversity, but she didn't just rise above it. She flipped over it, twisting her pain into fuel. Long before she was a champion, she was already defying gravity. Simone Biles' rise wasn't an accident. It was a perfect collision of talent, opportunity, and tenacity, sharpened by years of discipline and sacrifice. After that daycare field trip sparked her interest, Simone began training seriously at Bannon's Gymnastics in Houston. It wasn't long before her coaches realized they were watching something special, not just raw skill, but an unteachable blend of fearlessness, explosive strength, and something rare still, joy in the face of challenge. By the age of 8, Simone was performing skills years ahead of her peers. Her small stature, eventually just 4 to 8, gave her a physical advantage. She could rotate faster, spring higher, and execute twists with an almost supernatural sense of air awareness. But none of it came easy. Her coaches pushed her, the routines got harder, and Simone, with her quiet drive, just kept pushing back. One of the most influential figures in her early life was Coach Amy Borman, who began training Simone when she was a young girl and continued guiding her through her rise to stardom. Borman didn't just teach Simone gymnastics, she taught her how to be a competitor, how to channel energy, silence doubt, and turn nerves into power. Theirs was a partnership built on trust, patience, and mutual respect, while many elite gymnasts trained through intense, even rigid systems. Simone's training was tailored to her well-being. Her parents and Borman protected her childhood, even as she entered a sport that often erases it. Simone was homeschooled to allow for more flexible training hours, but her life wasn't consumed by gymnastics alone. She loved pizza, spending time with her siblings, and doing backflips in the backyard for fun. She was grounded by faith, family, and laughter by 14. Simone was already turning heads in junior elite competitions. Her routines were packed with difficulty and risk, moves most girls wouldn't attempt, let alone perfect. She didn't just complete skills, she exploded through them, making even the hardest combinations look effortless. But Simone's greatest strength wasn't just physical, it was mental. She had a quiet confidence, a deep internal compass, and a refusal to be anything but herself. Her foundation wasn't fame. It was forged in sweat, family, and the kind of belief that doesn't need to shout to be heard. Simone wasn't just learning gymnastics. She was building the tools that would redefine the sport. By 2013, Simone Biles was no longer just a rising star. She was a force hurtling toward the global stage, unstoppable and uncompromising. That year, at just 16 years old, she stepped into the senior elite level and headed to the World Artistic Gymnastics Championships in Antwerp, Belgium. What happened there would change the course of her life and the history of gymnastics. Simone didn't just win, she stunned the world. She claimed 2 gold medals, including the coveted all-around title, instantly establishing herself as the best gymnast on the planet. Her routines were not only technically superior, they were daring, filled with skills no one else attempted. Her tumbling passes defied physics. Her landings were solid. Her movements were crisp, powerful, and uniquely hers. Suddenly, people realized this wasn't just a new champion. This was a gymnast operating in an entirely new dimension. She was just getting started over the next few years. Simone would go on to dominate the sport in a way no woman ever had. From 2013 to 2016, she won 3 consecutive all-around world championship titles, a feat never accomplished before by an American woman. Her consistency was unshakable. Her routines were upgraded year after year, and her scores soared far above her peers. She made the impossible look routine. But it wasn't just her difficulty that set her apart. It was her presence. Simone competed with joy. While others showed nerves, she smiled. She danced between skills with a kind of radiance that lit up the arena. Audiences weren't just watching a gymnast, they were witnessing an evolution. Commentators, judges, and even former Olympians agreed. Simone Biles wasn't just winning competitions. She was redefining the very nature of women's gymnastics. Her rise also came at a time when the sport was shifting. The old standards of rigid beauty and passive performance were being replaced by power, personality, and authenticity, all of which Simone embodied. She didn't try to conform. She made the sport bend around her. And so, by the time the world began preparing for the 2016 Olympics, one thing was certain. Simone Biles wasn't just the favorite. She was the future. By the summer of 2016, Simone Biles was no longer just a gymnastic sensation. She was a global icon in the making. The world turned its attention to Rio de Janeiro, where the Olympic Games promised to be her coronation. Years of training, pressure, and anticipation had built toward this moment, and Simone delivered not just medals, but a performance that would redefine greatness in the sport. She entered the competition with sky-high expectations and somehow soared even higher. Over the course of the Games, Simone captured 4 gold medals and 1 bronze, the most medals by an American gymnast at a single Olympics in over 30 years. She dominated the all-around vault floor exercise and contributed to the U.S. team's dominant gold medal performance in the team final, famously dubbed the Final Five. But it wasn't just what she won. It was how she won. Her routines included moves so difficult that the scoring system had to evolve to accommodate them. On vault, she launched into the air with such power that it looked as if gravity paused to admire her. On floor, her signature move, the Biles, a double layout with a half twist, became an instant classic. Her artistry met brute force in a way gymnastics had never fully seen before. Crowds roared. Commentators searched for comparisons, but Simone Biles wasn't like anyone else. She was creating a new standard. Even fellow gymnasts watched in awe, not with envy, but with respect. They knew they were witnessing something rare, a complete gymnast in total command of her craft. And yet, off the mat, Simone remained grounded. She shared goofy selfies with teammates, laughed through press conferences, and gave credit to her coaches, her parents, and her faith. She wasn't just a competitor, she was a role model. Her success in Rio wasn't just historic, it was transformative. It shifted public perception of what women athletes could be: powerful, joyous, unapologetically dominant. She became the first woman of color to win an Olympic all-around gold for the U.S., breaking barriers not just in skill, but in visibility and representation. Simone Biles didn't just win the Olympics in Rio. She owned them with grace, grit, and greatness. After Rio, Simone Biles didn't just return home as a champion, she returned as a global phenomenon. She was no longer only known within the world of gymnastics. She had become a household name, a symbol of excellence and a cultural icon. But with glory came new challenges, the weight of fame, the expectations of perfection, and the quiet, growing pressure to keep going when the body and the mind needed rest. In the months following the Olympics, Simone's life changed rapidly. She went on a national tour with her teammates, made countless TV appearances, and even competed on Dancing with the Stars. She published a memoir, Courage to Soar, which became a bestseller. Endorsements rolled in, magazine covers, red carpet events, interviews. Simone had become a star far beyond her sport. But beneath the bright lights, a different reality was setting in. For the first time in years, Simone was off the competition floor, and with that pause came reflection. Who was she outside of gymnastics? What did she want now that she had achieved everything the sport could offer? The pressure didn't disappear. It evolved. Now every move she made was scrutinized. Every comeback questioned. Every competition came with the unspoken expectation Simone Biles must win. But Simone is not built for complacency. By 2018, she returned to training and competition with renewed intensity, and she returned not as a girl chasing a dream, but as a woman reclaiming her voice at the 2018 U.S. National Championships. She competed with 2 broken toes and a kidney stone. Most athletes wouldn't have even stepped onto the mat. Simone not only competed, she won with scores that blew away the competition. Her performance wasn't just dominant, it was defiant. Still, something deeper was stirring beneath the surface. The world saw the medals, the smiles, the gravity-defying flips. But few knew the emotional cost of being the greatest. The trauma of the sport's dark underbelly was beginning to surface, and Simone, more than anyone, was feeling the burden of carrying both the sport's future and its painful past. The time after Rio wasn't just about sustaining greatness, it was about surviving it. And in that space between triumph and truth, Simone Biles began to discover a different kind of strength. one rooted not in performance, but in vulnerability. For all her athletic power, Simone Biles' most courageous moment didn't happen on a balance beam or beneath the Olympic rings. It happened with a microphone in front of the world when she chose to speak the truth. Not about medals, but about trauma. In 2018, Simone Biles revealed that she was one of the hundreds of gymnasts abused by former USA Gymnastics DR. Larry Nassar, a man who had preyed on athletes for decades under the guise of medical care. Simone's decision to speak out wasn't easy. She was by then the face of the sport, the brightest star in an organization now deeply tarnished. But she refused to stay silent. In a statement posted online, she wrote, "I am not afraid to tell my story anymore." It was more than a confession. It was a declaration. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for all the girls who have been hurt, silenced, and ignored. She demanded accountability not just from Nassar, but from USA Gymnastics and the U.S. Olympic Committee, which had enabled his abuse through negligence and cover-ups. In doing so, Simone transformed from champion to change-maker. Her courage resonated far beyond the gym. Survivors around the world saw their own pain reflected in her voice. Fellow athletes rallied behind her. Lawmakers began to investigate, and the image of Simone testifying before Congress in 2021, tearful yet composed, became an indelible moment in American sports history. But even as she fought for justice, Simone kept training. She continued to dominate competitions, all while carrying the weight of a broken system on her shoulders. Her performance became about more than gold. It was now about healing, resistance, and truth. Simone redefined strength not as stoicism, but as honesty. She showed that the greatest athletes aren't those who never struggle. They're the ones who rise anyway. She blurred the line between hero and human, proving you can be both. Through her voice, Simone did what even her most difficult vaults couldn't. She shattered the silence. And in that silence, a new definition of power emerged, one that didn't need applause to matter. She wasn't just flipping through the air anymore. She was changing the ground beneath us. When the Tokyo Olympics finally arrived in 2021, delayed a year by the global pandemic, Simone Biles stood as the undisputed face of the Games. The world expected dominance, another sweep of golds, and more physics-defying feats. But instead, Simone gave us something far more important, a lesson in courage that had nothing to do with medals. In the middle of the team competition, after a shaky vault, Simone withdrew. At first, the announcement stunned the world. Then came the explanation. She was experiencing a condition gymnasts dread, the twisties. It's a mental block where the body and brain lose synchronization midair. For an average person, it's hard to grasp. For a gymnast performing flips and twists 10 feet above the ground, it's a matter of life and death. Suddenly, the strongest athlete in the world had said the unthinkable, "I need to step back." And she did. Her decision sent shock waves across the Olympic stage. Critics questioned her toughness. Pundits debated, but athletes across every sport rallied in support. They knew the cost. They understood the courage it takes to say not today. Simone didn't disappear after withdrawing. She showed up every day in the arena, cheering for her teammates, supporting them, smiling, crying. She became a beacon, not just of what it means to compete, but what it means to be human under pressure. Days later, she returned for one final event, the balance beam final, and performed a simplified routine, earning a bronze medal. But the real triumph wasn't on the podium. It was in her choice to protect her mental health in front of the entire world. Simone flipped the script on what strength means in a culture obsessed with pushing through pain. She offered a different model, wisdom, self-awareness, and radical vulnerability. She reminded us that even the most decorated athletes are not machines. They're people with limits, trauma, and needs. And that recognizing those limits isn't weakness. It's the deepest form of strength. In Tokyo, Simone didn't win 4 gold medals, but she gave something far more lasting. She gave permission to pause, to protect oneself, and to choose well-being over expectation. After Tokyo, many wondered if Simone Biles would ever return to competition. She had already transcended the sport, not just as the most decorated gymnast in history, but as a symbol of resilience and honesty. But Simone wasn't finished, not with gymnastics, and not with her own story. For over a year, she stepped back from the competitive world. She focused on healing mentally, emotionally, and physically. She went to therapy. She spoke at mental health events. She inspired athletes across disciplines to reevaluate what winning really means. And in 2023, quietly but powerfully, she made her return. When Simone walked back into the arena at the US Classic in August 2023, it felt less like a comeback and more like a homecoming. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She wasn't chasing medals. She was doing it on her terms, and still she dominated in that meet. And later at the 2023 US Gymnastics Championships, Simone not only won, she stunned the world again with her athletic evolution. She debuted new routines. She performed a Yurchenko double pike vault, a move so difficult and dangerous that few men attempted it. Once again, a skill was named after her. Once again, Simone had pushed the boundaries of what the human body can do. But this version of Simone was different. There was more laughter, more stillness, more choice. She was no longer just the greatest of all time. She was a woman in control of her narrative, deciding when to perform, how to perform, and why. Off the mat, her life flourished too. In 2023, she married NFL safety Jonathan Owens in a private ceremony, later celebrated with a grand destination wedding. She spoke openly about love, joy, and the challenges of balancing elite sport with normal life. Her relationship became another symbol, not of perfection, but of grounding, of being seen and supported beyond the spotlight. Simone's return wasn't about reclaiming titles. It was about reclaiming herself. And in doing so, she redefined what longevity looks like in a sport notorious for burning out young athletes. She didn't come back as the girl who had something to prove. She came back as the woman who had already proven everything and still chose to rise. Simone Biles is, by every measurable standard, the most decorated gymnast in history. With over 30 world and Olympic medals, including 4 skills named after her, she has redefined the limits of the sport, not just by winning, but by reshaping what greatness means. And yet, her true legacy extends far beyond the medals, the routines, or even the accolades. Simone Biles has changed the culture of gymnastics. Before her, power was admired, but artistry was favored. After her, the standards shifted. She made it impossible to ignore that strength, difficulty, and confidence are just as beautiful as grace. She didn't just raise the bar, she launched it into the air, spun around it twice, and landed with a smile. And then she asked, "What's next?" She has become a blueprint, not just for gymnasts, but for athletes across every sport. Her advocacy for mental health, athlete safety, and self-worth has inspired a movement. She showed that stepping away is not failure, that protecting your peace is a radical act of self-respect, and that even in silence you can speak volumes. Young gymnasts now grow up not just admiring Simone's skill, but emulating her strength of character. She has shown them that it's okay to say no, to ask for help, to define success for yourself. In a world that demands constant performance, she offered something braver, authenticity, and she's still going. Whether she continues to compete through another Olympic cycle or chooses a different path, her mark on gymnastics and on society is permanent. Museums are displaying her leotards. Books are being written about her. And children across the world are learning to cartwheel because they saw her do it. Simone Biles isn't just the best gymnast the world has ever seen. She's a cultural shift wrapped in muscle and movement, a story of resilience, honesty, and quiet revolution. Her life proves that strength isn't measured by how much you carry, but by knowing when to set it down, that excellence means nothing without integrity, and that the most powerful flips are the ones that bring you back to yourself. Simone's story isn't finished, but even now, mid-vault, mid-flight, her legacy is already landing exactly where it belongs, in the hearts of those she's lifted just by being herself.